National Spokesperson of ActionSA, the fastest growing political party in formation in our country. We're here to shake things up. We're here to make sure that we can continue on our legacy of the People's Dialogue. That's how we started. We got people, South Africans around different parts of the country on the ground, talking about what it is that they envisage as a future South Africa, the kind of country they want to live in. And in that spirit, we are starting what is going to be a series of conversations such as this one, where we are going to be leading up to our policy conference that's coming up this September. And so all of you are welcome as experts in your fields, and you're going to help us shape the conversations around what policy can look like in order to be able to have restorative and transformative power for our communities. As we all know, South Africa is going through turmoil at the moment, and what we need is a new country, rebuilt country, and a country that can be on a forward-looking trajectory that can be positive for all South Africans. And so we really thank you for your time. We thank you for your indulgence in this regard. And so, we are really looking forward to the discussions that are going to be taking place this morning. How we're going to proceed is that we are going to have, I'm going to ask my colleague, Johann Krige, who is the head of policy for the organization. He is, the brain, the mind, the guy who helps us conceptualize, formulate, and organize our policy thinking systems within the organization. I want him to come up and just give us context as to how the day is going to run. And then from then on, we'll proceed with presentations from various members of this panel. How the day is going to transpire is that we are going to have different experts come up, do their presentations, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A. We are streaming live, and so I do ask that everybody keeps to their time. Don't be like some people I know, and they usually start with, I'm not going to be long. And that's generally when they are about to be very long. And so with that said, let me lead by example and get off the floor and allow my colleague Johann Krige to come up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This is the start. This is the first of our expert policy panels. So it's the start of a new process for ActionSA and I think for the policy development process in South Africa. So we just really want to thank you for being here today and making your time available and sharing your expertise with us. And it's not only sharing it with us, but it's sharing it with South Africa. I think, like Lerato mentioned, I think for South Africans, a lot of us feel like we are in a bad place as a country. So there's a lot of things to feel really angry and really sad about. But what we're trying to achieve here is to show that there is hope. There is a different way of doing things. So this is the start of that process to make sure that we involve expert opinions and expert voices in coming up with the solutions to these massive problems that we are facing as a society. So I think there might be a temptation today to talk about everything that's wrong, just because there's so much that is wrong in our country, specifically relating to corruption. So I do want to encourage us to focus on the solutions to these problems. I think we can't talk about the solutions without talking about the problems, and I really want us to get to the root causes of the problems that we are facing as a country, rather than just focusing on the symptoms, because oftentimes policy solutions focus only on the symptoms rather than focusing on what really needs to be fixed at the core so that the system can change. And I think that is what we are trying to do here, is understanding how to change the system, because this is a massive undertaking that will require not a few political leaders. It will require thousands of South African leaders from all walks of life to come together and try and solve our problems. So thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to our listeners for participating in this conversation. Like Lerato mentioned, we are live streaming this, so there will be people on social media that can participate. We're going to open up to social media a bit later for questions. The first hour or so, we'll open up the floor to our experts that so graciously volunteered their time today to share some expertise from their specific fields related to corruption. And then in the second part of the day, we will have a roundtable discussion where we will be asking questions, and we'll open the floor to talk about various aspects and how we can develop a public policy framework that can really move South Africa towards becoming a society where corruption isn't robbing us as citizens and our future generations from a better life. So with that being said, again, really want to say thank you so much for being here. This is for myself, this is an extremely exciting opportunity to engage with people that are vastly more intelligent than I am and have way better expertise. So this is a great opportunity for us to involve expert voices. This is part of our policy development process and engagement process. We're also engaging with ActionSA branches, and we are opening up this discussion to the public broadly. So by doing this, we're really trying to ensure that we get as many voices involved in this thing, and that we get voices that are often left out of the conversation to also get to be heard and to be part of this process. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Gregor from CAS to just say a few words. And sorry, I forgot to mention, we just really want to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their support. They've been a great partner for our policy development process, specifically over the years. And it's with their generous support that we are able to host this event today. So thank you so much, and over to Gregor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I promise not to be too long in my welcoming remarks. On behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you this morning. My name is Krige. I'm the resident representative of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, South Africa. And I'm very glad to be here with you this morning to discuss this timely and complex topic of corruption. Please allow me first a few words about the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. As a think tank closely allied to the German CDU, the party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, we promote democracy, good governance, human rights and rule of law through more than 100 offices worldwide. We foster dialogue between policymakers, actors from the private sector and civil society. And by bringing together people who embrace their societal responsibility, we promote the establishment of professional networks and the exchange of innovative ideas to tackle current challenges. And talking about current challenges, that leads me to anti-corruption activities, which are of great importance to us as a political foundation, as a means of supporting good governance in South Africa. We as CAS are glad to finance today's ActionSA Policy Conference because we highly appreciate all players from politics, media, academia, and civil society who are engaged in the fight against the scourge of corruption. I recently arrived in South Africa from previous assignments in Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Iraq. Each of these have revealed different phases of corruption and the dangers of weak criminal justice administrations. While I'm a supporter of federalism, in Kenya I saw how a devolution program led to the dispersion of corruption from the political center to many counties due to a lack of anti-corruption measures. And while I'm a supporter of the market economy and international trade, in DRC I experienced how a country blessed by God with endless riches of mineral resources, nevertheless is one of the poorest societies worldwide with a very high infant mortality rate. All this is attributed to corrupt political elites colluding with international companies. And finally, while I'm a supporter of international development, cooperation, and reconstruction, in Iraq I saw how reconstruction and the unleashing of large amounts of investment led to an orgy of corruption due to a lack of a functioning justice system. And to cut a long story short, corruption is an international sickness that eats our future and therefore eats our children. Without a functioning criminal justice system, the fundamental characteristic of corruption is escalation, both horizontally through the public and private sector and vertically from the very top of society to the very bottom. And much like mineral resources attract international investment, societies with weak criminal justice systems attract international specialists in corruption. Political oligarchs and corruption enablers that will steal one's country. And unfortunately, as you as South Africans all know better than me, corruption and state capture have become endemic in the country's political system. And I have learned about state capture that it is not only simple corruption, it is more than that. It is a pattern, it is a structure of corruption and an attack on democracy and an attack on state institutions. I would like to take the opportunity to thank here in the room and online, those who are making their important contribution to fighting corruption and who are also risking a lot in the process of doing so. So once again, I'm very glad to be here with you this morning. I wish you all an insightful and intellectually stimulating conference with fruitful discussions and implementable outcomes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Gregor. Thank you very much to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. We are very grateful for your support, and without which, this morning would not be possible. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. I'm going to speak from here so that I don't have to go up and down. I'm not the one who's making presentations. Each of you are. And so we are going to move quite swiftly. Let me welcome and just mention the names as you see them on the board. But for record purposes, I will mention everybody who is here, who's going to speak this morning. We've got Mr. Paul Hoffman, who represents the organization Accountability Now. Professor Sope Williams, who represents the University of Stellenbosch, the Faculty of Law there. We've got Ms. Olwethu Majola, who also comes from the University of Cape Town, Center of Criminology. We've got on my right, Mr. Rajen Naidu, University of Stellenbosch, in the School of Leadership there. We have Athol Trollip. Your rank is said these days. You are the former mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay. We are seeing flames as a country with regards to mayoralties. So I really feel sorry for you. I'm so sorry that you occupy that space, but hopefully we'll get it right. We have got Dr. Liezl Groenewald, representing the Ethics Institute and Whistleblower House, a very important organization. We know that we've had lots of problems in the whistleblowing space in our country. And so we need that space to be a little bit more robust and that the people who assist us to build a better society can be protected. And then lastly, we have Mr. Klaus, who represents the Inclusive Society Institute. So thank you to all of these individuals I've mentioned. They will be giving us their representations. Let me start with Mr. Rajen Naidu, who is ready, who's going to talk about leadership. I think all of us are very aware of the fact that leadership dearth is what we are facing in our country at the moment. It is important to be able to conceptualize what sort of leadership is going to take us to the country that we envision, that I spoke about earlier, that is going to be a country of prosperity and a country of opportunity for all future generations. And so I welcome Mr. Rajen Naidu. Please ascend the floor. I'm not sure if you have, do you have a presentation you're going to speak to, or you're going to? Okay, so the presentation will be flighted on the screen, and then we'll talk through that. When he's done, I'm going to allow the second speaker to come through. I will not engage, and then we will have a round of Q&A to the different speakers. I'm not sure, do you want us to do it with each individual presentation or just do at the end? Okay, so it's going to be important to jot down your questions relevant to the presentations as the presentations are taking place, so that when we get to the end, your questions can be directed accordingly. So, Mr. Rajen Naidu, University of Stellenbosch School of Leadership, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lerato and Johann, and thank you for inviting Stellenbosch University over School of Public Leadership to have input in your event today. It's an honor and privilege to be here, and we hope we can be of benefit to your session. I specifically chose this topic because I felt it was quite pertinent. We have a serious issue in our country at the moment with regards to leadership, especially in the public sector. If one looks at, you know, the current trend on social media platforms, the media, newspaper, radio, etc., there's more negativity than anything else. And from a tertiary level, we have students that are also echoing the sentiments. And we find a greater need now to address these issues and to turn this tide of poor leadership. So basically, we have a generic definition of leadership, which encompasses the ability of an individual, group, or organization to lead, influence, or guide other individuals, teams, or entire organizations. Now, I'm sure every one of us sitting in the room here and those that are watching the live stream have a view on this and can comment in some way or the other, given our current political climate and the progress that we've made as a state. So I decided to actually name this presentation, and of recent, we've had a lot of talk about people eating. So I titled it, It's My Turn to Eat, because it seems that's what's happening in our country at the moment, at every corner. And I think this cartoon kind of depicts the current state of affairs. We have partners, but even the partners themselves are not entirely confident with each other. That being said, I think the challenge is on the table. We have corrupt leaders. There's so much that's been going on. We've got ex-presidents, etc., embroiled in state capture, and we can go on and on. And in the interest of time, I'm going to try and be as quick as possible and keep to my 15-minute. The consequences of poor leadership, and this is specifically with the public sector, low staff morale, promotes a culture of corruption. There's political interference in appointments. We all know about that. Poor service delivery, something very prominent. We see it every day in the media. A brain drain. A lot of our experts are actually leaving and going abroad. Lack of integration and silos. Classic example is the police service. Economic instability. We all know about that. Personal greed. Decline of personal ethical sensitivity. And obviously the erosion of public confidence and trust in our civil service and civil servants, and in particular, the leadership. We often say, and there's often comments about the electorate and why they keep voting for parties that let them down in some way or the other. People are always complaining subsequent and post-elections. Promises are broken and not kept. Mr. George Orwell, an ex-journalist and researcher, basically termed it as accomplices. But I think we have a bigger problem in South Africa where we need to educate our electorate. A large part and a portion of our community or citizens are not really aware of the dynamics affiliated to politics and the consequential damage of corruption, especially. We've had the state capture. Consequential damage was drastic, was dire. Our president decided to establish a commission of inquiry 4 years later and R1 billion later as well. We have a report. A lot may say not much has happened since then. A lot of court cases, a lot of cases that's been, well, 1 or 2 kicked out of court, big cases. The extradition of the Guptas hasn't really gone our way. Basically, I think we're looking at our National Prosecuting Authority, we're looking at our law enforcement agencies, and the sentiment out there is that we're not getting what we should be getting in terms of progress and wins. We all know about Eskom, and this is just an example of the dodgy tender tsunami that hit there. Mr. Lerato, who wrote the recent book, Truth to Power, he's made a lot of allegations that's still being looked into, a lot of denial surrounding that as well. Eskom is kind of at the center of everything at the moment, basically holding our country to ransom. We all know about the locomotives that didn't actually fit on the tracks. An embarrassment as well. And all of this, it comes back to leadership. So, and I think my point is that these are such huge transactions. They're in the billions of rands, and they were allowed to happen. They were actioned because top leadership allowed it to happen. In fact, top leadership were involved in this. And ultimately, we had lower level staff that actually got involved in these scams and blindly took money. And as you see at the bottom there, they bought luxury BMWs, Jeeps, Mercedes-Benz, and even houses for cash, but were unable to explain how they managed to afford it once the investigation drilled down to them. We have police corruption, a lot of allegations of corrupt policemen amongst the elite units, crime intelligence in particular, here in the Western Cape as well, a lot of allegations of a rogue unit operating within the police. We had the murder of Colonel Charles Kenia. There again, some top leader pulled a stop on his security detail. And we all know what happened thereafter. And up to today, that investigation is still progressing. We haven't had much joy in getting to know exactly what's going on there. And one can go on and on, but in the interest of time, I think I'm going to move on. We've had our ex-acting commissioner of police embroiled in more than one saga. And this is top leadership. This is our law enforcement. This is the backbone of our country in keeping people in check. We all know when Jackie Selebe was appointed the head of Interpol. Personally, I celebrated that. He was the first African to be appointed the head of Interpol, and not only for South Africans, but for Africans per se. And his fall from grace was, I think, the biggest disappointment, especially on the law enforcement side, and not to mention the rest of the country as well. We have huge issues with whistleblowers. I was just discussing with Liezl earlier on. Just recently, there was a whistleblower down in KZN that was dealing with a case where a husband was illegally stopped and detained, and a bribe was demanded by the police. She recorded everything. She's an ex-employee of a State Department, and that led to the dismissal of these two police officers. When the criminal case went to court, she received several death threats, which she reported, but nothing was done. Subsequently, she was shot dead whilst driving, shot 6 times in broad daylight. So there you go. We all know Babita Deokaran, and we thought maybe that would be the last of it, and the tide would change with the protection of whistleblowers, etc. Unfortunately, the progress on that seems to be dragging its heels, and we can't seem to make much headway in that. And hopefully, Dr. Liezl Groenewald has some good news for us in her presentation, and we could look forward to something like that. We all look for the way forward, and there's a video clip, a very short video clip, which I'd like you to watch. And I think it encompasses what we as a country and everybody, be it the private, public sector, or citizens, that need to basically garner the way forward. So.
Germany was a recipient of aid after the Second World War. So was Japan, so was South Korea, so was Malaysia, or even famous Singapore. They all received aid. But there's something special about them, which is they all, without exception, graduated from being aid recipients within 20 years. By the time those 20 years were over, they were actually giving aid to other people. But Africa, 60 years later, Africans are negotiating on a global stage the next form of aid they think they want to be getting. Why is it that we are not able to graduate from aid? In the past, we used to blame colonialists, but today, the threat to African economies or destruction of African economies by Africans, the sabotage of our own economies by Africans is on the rise. And I think that we cannot keep making the same mistakes and expecting different outcomes or better results. We need to get our act together. I think it's possible for Africa to rise, but it won't do so until we get organized and we work differently.
And with those parting words, I wish you well and all the best to my next presenters. Thank you.
That's quite alarming. That 60 years later, we're negotiating new masters. Thank you very much, Rajen, for that presentation. I was about to give you big ups and props for. No. Everybody, the book that you see on the table is courtesy of Mr. Paul Hoffman, who's about to go up. I'm hoping, Paul, that you are going to help us navigate towards solutions. I hope that in this book, we're going to talk about that. So let's welcome to the stage, Mr. Paul Hoffman.
Thank you, Lerato, and thank you, ASA, for the invitation. It's great to be here, and for the benefit of the audience in cyberspace, the book's name is Countering the Corrupt, and it is available in electronic format on the website of Accountability Now, which is accountabilitynow.org.za. There's also an earlier book. You'll see that one I wrote in 2016. This one is last year. And the 2016 book is called Confronting the Corrupt. So you can see I've mellowed over the years. I'm now countering them. The next book I write will be called Conquering the Corrupt. But I'm not telling you when I'm writing it.
Paul, can I counter yourself? We are ActionSA. There is no ASA. I just want, for the record, to show that it's actually ActionSA.
I hope that's also not coming out of my time.
I hope so, yeah.
All right, 9:33 and 15 minutes to go. Let's get down to business. There is indeed a problem in South Africa with serious corruption, and that takes the form of kleptocracy, which is governance by the thieves, state capture, which is repurposing the state in order to make it work for you instead of for the benefit of the people, and then what we call grand corruption, which is really the my turn to eat that we've just heard about from Stellenbosch University. And what I suggest to this audience is the answer to the problem is the creation of establishment of a new Chapter 9 institution, because Chapter 9 institutions are there to uphold constitutional democracy. And we call it the Integrity Commission. Your fellows in the DA, that's the Democratic Alliance, if I'm not allowed to use those three-letter acronyms here, have called it the Anti-Corruption Commission, and Action South Africa can give it its own name as long as we do what is required by law. Now, what is required by law? We are living in a constitutional democracy under the rule of law. Our constitution is regarded as our supreme law. The rule of law is also supreme. We accept that the final decision of a court of law is binding on the people to whom it applies and needs to be enforced and implemented. What we have in South Africa is the recipe to deal with corruption at all levels, a recipe put together by the Constitutional Court in March 2011. That was in the case now known as Glenister 2, a matter in which the constitutionality of closing down the Scorpions, who had been good at their job, and replacing them with the Hawks, who have never been good at their job, and taking South Africa forward from the efficient and effective anti-corruption work that was done by the Scorpions to a new level in the future. What the court decided was that because South Africa has a Bill of Rights which is justiciable, the state is obliged, it must respect, protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. And we have a whole chapter, chapter 2, our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, which spells out the rights that we are all entitled to. And many of them are very expensive rights. Some of them are subject to progressive realization on the basis of available resources, and some of them have been deliverable in full since day one of the new South Africa. So if you have that obligation in your constitution, then you have to organize your affairs in such a way that available resources are made available for human rights. Obviously, if available resources are being looted by kleptocrats and other corrupt people, then you're not going to get to the point where the purpose of the Constitution, which is to govern openly, accountably, and responsibly, will ever be achieved. So the court sat down and said, what we need in South Africa, and this is binding, I'm not just suggesting it, it is the law, is an effective and efficient anti-corruption entity clothed with 5 basic principles. The first is that the entity should be specialized, not doing all sorts of other work like the Hawks do, but specialized in dealing with corruption. The second is that the personnel in that entity need to be properly trained so that they are one step ahead of the corrupt. Corrupt people are very resourceful, very cunning, very calculating, and they see to it that their efforts are done in the dark in a way that keeps them one step ahead of law enforcement. So proper training of law enforcement is essential. The third and most important characteristic of anti-corruption machinery in South Africa, as laid down by the Constitutional Court, is that the anti-corruption body should be independent. Now, to be independent in this context means to be free of political control, to be outside the interference, the influence, and the impedance of politicians, and able to do the job without fear, favor, or prejudice, meaning without fear of the powerful, without favoring your friends, and without prejudicing the public weal. The fourth characteristic of anti-corruption machinery of state is that it should be properly resourced in guaranteed fashion. Now, that is not the case at the moment. The Director General of Justice has to be asked every time they need a pencil or a toilet roll in the National Prosecuting Authority, and there are similar lines of thinking in the police. So we do not have guaranteed resources. In Hong Kong, they actually made a law that said a percentage of our budget goes to anti-corruption work every year. There's not a debate about it among politicians. That percentage of the budget is just given over, and it is utilized by the anti-corruption, the Hong Kong anti-corruption entity. In South Africa, even the National Prosecuting Authority is not free of the Department of Justice. It is under the final responsibility of the Minister of Justice, and as I've mentioned, the Director General of Justice is its accounting officer. The last, and perhaps the most important from the point of view of the history of South Africa, the last characteristic is the secure tenure of office of the anti-corruption body. Now, a secure tenure of office is what the Scorpions did not have. So we ought not to get excited when Fikile Mbalula says we should bring back the Scorpions, as he did in the Sunday Times last Sunday, and as I have commented on in Daily Maverick this morning. So those of you who need to catch up on your WhatsApps or have a nap, just take a rest now, because I'm dealing with that, and you can pick it up in the Maverick or maybe listen to the recording here. Secure tenure of office implies that it is difficult to dislodge your corruption busters. And there's an obvious reason for this, because when the corruption busters start going after politically well-connected people, they are in a position to do what happened in Polokwane in 2007, which is to pull the plug on the corruption busters. They were going after people like Jackie Salebi. They were going after Jacob Zuma himself. They were getting far too close to far too many well-connected people connected to the ANC and its alliance partners. And as a consequence of not having secure tenure of office, the Scorpions went west, and we were unable to persuade the court that it was irrational to close down the Scorpions. I think if the court had known then what we know now from the Zondo Commission, it may have come to a different conclusion about the rationality of closing down a well-functioning anti-corruption body such as the Scorpions were. But the Scorpions were weak in the sense that their independence as a unit within the NPA was inadequate, and their security of tenure of office caused their demise. A simple majority in Parliament was enough to close them down. So those criteria have become known because I invented an acronym, and we know we're allergic to acronyms here, but the acronym is STIRS, S-T-I-R-S, specialized, trained, independent, resourced in guaranteed fashion, and secure in tenure of office. Now, in our constitutional dispensation, the best and the easiest way to get that to happen, to get a STIRS compliant anti-corruption body, is to set up this Chapter 9 institution that we have been talking about at Accountability Now since 2012. We even got to present to the Constitutional Review Committee in Parliament in 2016. But the chairman of that committee was a man called Vincent Smith. That name ring a bell? Yes, that's right. He's the one who's currently gracing the dock in a criminal trial in which he is accused of corrupt activity. So under his chairmanship, our representations went nowhere. We did get excited, though, after 2016, when in 2019, the IFP stood up in Parliament at President's question time and said, President Ramaphosa, why don't we deal with serious corruption by creating an integrity commission under Chapter 9? And the president, instead of saying, no, too many of my friends will go to jail if you do that, said, that's a refreshing thought. Let me mull it over. Well, that was 2019, and we know that he has difficulty making decisions, but this kind of activity and an upcoming election may persuade him that it is now time for action. Not Action South Africa, action. So I'm not going to let you go. So the excitement around that was stoked further when in August 2020, that's just a year later, the ANC National Executive Committee, which is its highest decision-making body between elections, passed a resolution in which it said, Cabinet urgently establish a standalone, permanent, independent anti-corruption body to deal with corruption. And we looked at that and we said, well, that sounds quite a lot like STIRS. And we waited and we waited and nothing happened. So in August 2021, we presented to Parliament our version of the remedial legislation that would be required. That is constitutional amendments and an enabling statute to give powers to the Integrity Commission, as we call it. And we gave that to Parliament, we gave it to the Executive, we gave it to the NPA. The NPA acknowledged receipt. The Executive ignored us, and Parliament invited us back again, and we made a second presentation in March this year, that's 2023, to the Constitutional Review Committee without Vincent Smith in the chair, and we're waiting to hear from them, but one has to wait patiently, except in an election year. We feel that if sufficient pressure is brought to bear, this government ought to start processing that legislation. We have been joined in our efforts by the Democratic Alliance, which has stepped up from its initial position, which was fix the hawks, don't worry about the NPA. They now have produced an anti-corruption commission bill, which is in the form of a private member's bill by the Shadow Minister of Justice. And if you compare that bill with our bill, the name Integrity Commission or Anti-Corruption Commission, we don't mind, is all that is really different between the two. The two drafts parallel each other in a way that is very flattering to accountability now, seeing that we got there first. So that is where we are at in relation to, have I taken up more of my time than I'm allowed? I don't think so. I started at 9:33. Huh? You're now being nice to me. Oh, this is good. We're in a situation where, in my humble submission, it is incumbent upon all political formations in South Africa, not only the opposition, but all political formations, to get real about the cancerous and corrosive effect of serious corruption, and to unite in reforming the law in order to implement the decision that was taken in Glenister 2 as long ago as 2011. We know that the ANC had no appetite for that under the leadership of Jacob Zuma. We hope that Cyril Ramaphosa has slightly better appetite for it, but the trouble that we have at the moment is that the cabinet is laboring under the misapprehension that the minority judgment in Glenister 2 is actually the majority judgment. And that is not the case. And it is pathetic that they have not climbed down on this. I'm now at the point where I'm asking highly placed people in the public administration to get an opinion from senior counsel to persuade cabinet that it's actually on a dwaalspoor. You know what a dwaalspoor is? A track into the wilderness that gets you nowhere. And the difficulty is that because cabinet does not understand the law that binds it, it is now planning to upgrade or make permanent the investigating directorate of the National Prosecuting Authority, which is a body formed by proclamation in 2019 by President Ramaphosa as a sort of stopgap because everybody's realized that the Hawks don't cut it. They really can't get their act together. So if the ANC-led government persists with its ideas around upgrading the investigating directorate to what it calls permanent as part of the NPA, well, A, we know it's not permanent because look what happened to the Scorpions, and this new body will be no different to what the Scorpions were. And B, it will not be compliance with the independence and secure tenure of office requirements of the law. And that's not because I'm saying so, it's because the majority in Glenister 2 said so, and that needs to be implemented. So I hope that I have invigorated ActionSA to get behind the idea of the reform of the criminal justice administration in such a way that effective and efficient anti-corruption machinery is put in place by way of a Chapter 9 institution. Chapter 9 institutions do not report to Parliament, they to the Cabinet, they report to Parliament. And that takes that executive element out of their operations. And that makes them a more democratic and effective way of delivering the promises of the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I do want to just read just the first paragraph in the book because I think it really sharpens our focus on this issue. You say that corruption is one of the great scourges of our age. It is estimated that trillions of dollars are paid in bribes every year, and that developing regions lose 10 times more to corruption than they receive in foreign aid. That is quite alarming. With illicit outflows of the funds that they desperately need totaling more than $1 trillion per year. The reason for this is not a lack of laws prohibiting corruption in its various forms. There is no shortage of those, but the impunity enjoyed by those guilty of contravening them, resulting from their control of the institutions which are supposed to see to it that law is enforced. And when I read that, I came to appreciate what I think some of us woke up to this morning, that what we don't often focus on is the loss of life that results from corrupt activity. Just this morning, a woman who was to testify in one of the government departments in KZN was killed just this morning in Tongad. And so, you know, I just Googled political killings just now, just on a whistleblowing flow. And what comes up is more alarming than what we all realize. And so the loss of life is also something that we really need to focus on as we deal with this topic. With that somber moment, I apologize for introducing you that way. Olwethu Majola comes from the University of Cape Town Center for Criminology. She will be speaking to us about the public-private partnerships in this effort. And so let's welcome Ms. Majola. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to, share our ideas and thoughts around these issues, particularly because as academics, we're normally confined to our offices. Okay, great, thank you. Because we normally are confined to our research space, and it's always an exciting opportunity to share our thoughts, and particularly as I am a person who is more solution orientated, I thought I would just share some thoughts and then hopefully receive some feedback through the questions. So I'll be discussing strategies around combating corruption through public and private partnerships. As we have already seen from the state capture report, a lot of private entities, companies have been involved in grand corruption in this country. And I have felt that not enough accountability has been targeted towards those entities. And I feel there's enough room to bring them to the table in terms of not only accountability, but also prevention measures. Okay, so this is an idea that is based on an existing practice. Currently, there are some anti-money laundering strategies that involve the private sector. So my suggestion would be more of a concerted effort, bringing together a number of stakeholders to come up with better strategies for combating corruption and preventing corruption. Also, there are also some emerging technologies that also come up when you look at public-private partnerships in various other industries, such as the commodities industries. So technologies, for example, that would track contracts and also how payments are made from those contracts. So the idea is basically to combine many strategies into a workable formula. So why PPPs? So as we already know, corruption is a crime that involves money and the flow of money. A lot of illicit financial flows from the crime of corruption end up leaving the country. Some are laundered and disguised as legitimate gains. And we already know that the cost to society is, of course, development, economic development. Funds that were meant to benefit our society are actually stolen. So, and then, of course, the people who are most affected are our most vulnerable population and our youth at the moment. And then we've seen this vicious cycle of crime being perpetuated because of the lack of accountability. So with PPPs, then we seek, I would say, to build coalition, to bring ideas together, and also to bring resources together. This would allow for a measure of accountability and transparency, where multiple actors come together to discuss solutions. And then just to look at possibilities for how these frameworks or strategies would work, we see that PPPs are a relatively new idea, and like I mentioned earlier before, have been limited to a particular industry, which has been resource management, and in some cases, property development type of projects. So now we would be shifting it towards a more mainstream activities in the country. So then when you bring together certain private actors, for example, if you're talking about multinational auditing firms, they already are held to higher international standards in the other jurisdictions within which they operate. So they can also bring the strategies that they use outside the country and then be able to implement and even augment the kind of strategies that we have. Also, we also have a deficient legal and policy framework for PPPs in South Africa, and not only in South Africa, but a lot of African countries. So I feel that if we would look into developing the laws and policies to broaden their applicability and relevance to other industries, that would be a way forward. Also, we could also be able to address enforcement deficiencies by having the input of other actors. Also, I think I've already mentioned, when you bring in your private sector actors, you have an opportunity to improve the existing mechanisms. As much as I appreciate the efforts to bring in new and accountable institutions, sometimes it's always good to optimize the existing mechanisms that we have. And then from the example of the anti-money laundering information sharing model, we see just an example through the South African Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Force that has 22 members from both the private and public sector, and mostly with banking industry representatives coming from the private sector to share information around the accountability for money laundering and other economic crimes. Quite interesting, we see working groups, expert working groups, which are tasked with sort of being ahead of the development in terms of the types of crimes and identifying these types of crimes, making sure that those who are responsible for implementation are not caught off guard. There's also, in terms of the law enforcement strategies that come out of these groups, in terms of working together and in identifying these crimes and also responding in a tactical manner. And then this is just an example of the groups that are currently existing and also that are governed by a set of protocols, a set of regulations, and then each of these falls under a broader framework, and then each protocol determines an objective. So for example, SAMLIT case selection criteria has a look at various possible cases and whether these cases can actually be successful if taken forward for prosecutions. And then the communication protocol is also more about raising awareness about economic crimes and money laundering and so forth. Yeah, that was a very quick presentation, and I'm looking forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your generosity. Paul, that's going to help the next speaker have a little bit more time. So thank you, Olwethu, for that. We appreciate it. I'm going to ask now Professor, is it Sope? Sope. I love it. Sope Williams to come up. She's going to be speaking to us about integrity and ethics in the public sector. I don't know if that's an oxymoron, but we will indulge you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is just the right size for me. Okay, maybe not. So my name is Sope Williams. I'm a law professor at Stellenbosch. Nice to see my colleague here, whom I've never met. But anyway, thank you for the invitation to ActionSA from ActionSA. A bit about my background, and I'm going to be really short in my presentation, so I can take all the time with the, So I'm a law professor. I'm from Nigeria. I studied in Nigeria and in England, worked as an academic in England, then moved to Nigeria, worked in kind of an anti-corruption, good governance NGO, which had the most corrupt boss I've ever had, and then moved to South Africa in 2016. So I always say that South Africa is my spiritual home. South Africa is also about 10 years behind where Nigeria is in corruption. So for me, it feels like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Very frightening. Very frightening. Also frightening because I I left Nigeria because of the corruption, basically. I really did. I just, yeah, the vibe didn't flow with me, if I can use my teenager's language. Anyway, so what I want to talk about is ethics and integrity in the public sector. I don't have a presentation, just because, no reason. But what I want to say is, my academic background is I have a PhD in public procurement and anti-corruption. So I'm basically a procurement lawyer. So I do a lot of work in public procurement and anti-corruption, and I've been doing that for 23 years now. So been in the corruption space, especially from an academic point of view for a while. Came to Stellenbosch specifically to set up a postgraduate course in public procurement policy and regulation, where I teach on public procurement, teach on anti-corruption in public procurement and all that, because my colleague and I, Professor Kino, if you know him, we knew that there was a problem with capacity, especially in the public procurement space, and we wanted to kind of address that, and Stellenbosch was willing to do that. So I've been doing that since we came. I mean, our course took off in 2020, but teaching it at undergraduate level before that and all that. So I do a lot of work in procurement and anti-corruption. And a few years ago, I realized that there was something missing. And that thing missing was the fact that for me, ethics and integrity are like the other side of the coin when you talk about corruption. But we don't give that as much attention and intention as we give anti-corruption. And, after being in this space for a while, I felt like anti-corruption or fighting corruption is almost too late in the game, right? It is like, not to be rude, but it's like taking the morning after pill instead of being on birth control, right? It's always safer, and it's also like taking the morning after pill. I mean, they tell you have to take it within 72 hours or something, but it's like taking it a week later. That's what I feel fighting corruption is like. It's like you're probably pregnant, so, there's no point sometimes. Not to say that, of course, we have to fight corruption and we can't do nothing, because that's not an option. But I do feel that we don't give as much attention to addressing integrity in the public sector, addressing ethics in the public sector, or inculcating ethics. So when I talk about ethics, I'm talking about, a commitment to behave responsibly and fulfill our obligations to others. Some people might say it's doing the right thing no matter whether you're being watched or not. And it's a capability. And I'm seeing with a lot of the work that I do in the private sector, there's so much attention being given to ethics. Big companies have a chief ethics officer. Companies realize that the biggest risks to them are ethical risks. And they're doing things to address that. But we don't have the same kind of language in the public sector. And what does this mean? What does this really look like? For me, I see such a big difference in the way we recruit in the public sector vis-a-vis the private sector. Now, anyone who's worked in the private sector here knows that, you would do a lot of psychometric evaluations. There'll be all sorts of tests for them to determine whether you are a right cultural fit. And a lot of that is determining whether you are a right ethical fit for the company. But we don't have that in the public sector. So if you're well connected or you're a comrade, I still don't know what that means, you will get a job in the public sector. It doesn't matter what your character looks like. And then when we see things playing out, we seem to be confused, but there isn't any confusion because we're getting the results of what we, garbage in, garbage out, not to call public sector people garbage, but, just use that phrase. So recruitment for me is a problem that we haven't given attention to. And I would like to see organizations like Accountability Now, like ActionSA, to think about what are we doing in terms of the people we're getting into our public sector, because South Africa, has tons of good people. Bad people are not in the majority at all. I don't believe that for 1 minute. But they seem to be more, they seem to be more effective because they're more organized, they're more intentional. Mr. Hoffman talked about that. They're more organized in the way that in achieving their objectives, whilst good people don't always get their acts together in order to have the same level of impact as corrupt people or bad actors. So we don't address recruitment. We don't have any, I don't see, maybe someone might educate me, but we don't seem to give that issue of recruitment any attention. We also don't give any attention to reward and progression. Whatever we reward, we see more of, right? If you are in the private sector, if you are in sales, they reward you for making sales. If you are, in marketing, they would reward you for doing the great campaigns. But in the public sector, what is rewarded? how do you progress? What do you have to do to become, to go through, to eventually become a DDG or a DG or whatever? So that again, I feel needs a lot more attention that we're giving it. And I think the third thing that is important to me is that whilst we understand, and I appreciate my colleague for talking about leadership, and that is crucial, but a focus that we don't have is how do we build ethical organizations? Because we can't rely only on ethical people. In as much as the tone from the top is crucial, but you can't have, a good head on a bad body, right? So we need to think about what do we do with our organizations? Is there any way that we can ensure that we're building ethical organizations? And what does that mean? There are three things that are crucial. Apart from having, the laws and the policies, and I'm a lawyer, so those are good, but they're not going to be effective if we focus on that in isolation. So when I hear people talking about more laws, sometimes I'm like, that's not, we have enough laws to fill this room with paper if we wanted to, right? In terms of codes of conduct for public officers, in terms of our anti-corruption laws, in terms of any law that has an implication for ethics and all that. But in terms of building ethical organizations, the tone from the top, so leadership is crucial. Incentives are super, super important. As I said, what are we rewarding? What are the if you're someone like you're a whistleblower, you're like Bebita, we know how that ends up. So the incentives for people to do the right thing are actually perverse, right? So they're not motivating people to do the right thing. And then the third thing that I think is important is having, and I think that's also related to whistleblowing as well, is having what we call in the private sector, they call it a culture of speak up and challenge. And so that's basically a culture where you can complain about something and there will be a remedy. So when we hear or when we get information in the media and someone has blown the whistle, that is the final stage. The person has already tried. And at least we know from all the stories, like if I take Bebita as well, so many times these issues were raised, but the organization did nothing. The bosses did nothing. So in that organization, there isn't a culture of speak up, a culture where you can challenge if you see wrongdoing. So for me, I feel like that those things need attention. And I hope that as ActionSA develops its policies, you will think about, before we get to anti-corruption, what comes before then? Because corruption for me is fighting corruption is the last stage. The horse has already bolted. And these things work. These things work. Now, I'll tell a story from Nigeria. In 2015, so we have a new president now, but we had a new president then, 2015, President Buhari, who came in on an anti-corruption platform. And one of the things that he did was recognizing that, so in Nigeria, we have a lot of embezzlements. People just take state money and they take it home. And so recognizing that was a problem, and in trying to recover this money, so not waiting for our version of SIU or MPA, because everything is corrupted. They issued a policy that if you could blow the whistle on where any public money was hidden, you would get 5% of that. And now in Nigeria, because of the devaluation of the currency, I mean, we saw from that video that corruption affects our economies and all that. People prefer to keep their money in US dollars because that doesn't lose its value, right? It's a better store of value. So what happened was that people who had helped big men to carry money and put in stacking apartments, or in some place, it was found in all sorts of places, we're now blowing the whistle. So calling the police and saying, I know my boss put money here because I carried it, because the big men don't carry the bags by themselves. In Nigeria, we call them the China bags, those jute bags, we call them the Ghana must go bags, another story. But so there'll be tons of Ghana must go bags, and in those bags, there'll be 5 million in cash, 10 million US dollars in cash. And so we were recovering all this money, and people were getting, so for someone who's a driver or, the domestic worker, to get 5% of 5 million US dollars is life-changing, even for me to be life-changing, right? So we're getting all this money, and the policy was working because money was creeping out of the woodwork, and in millions and millions of US dollars. So it was working. Of course, with Nigeria, the government will start a policy and will destroy that policy itself. Because after having to pay out all these percentages, someone in government had the bright idea and was like, you know what? Someone now recovered, I think, 20 million US dollars. So 5% of that would be what? 1 million US dollars. That's a lot of money. Anyway, And so they were like, someone in government was like, you know what, this is a lot of money for someone who's never even had $1,000 US. And in order that, so this will sound crazy, but that in order that this payout will not have an adverse psychological impact on the person, let's ask him to first get a psychiatric evaluation. so that when he gets the money, he will not lose his mind. And people were like, but it's my mind to lose, right? Give me my money. If I'm going to lose my mind, let me lose it for myself. So then, of course, then people lost trust and the policy just fizzled out because people stopped reporting. But the thing is that, so the point of the story is that there are things that can work, right? And we do have to give attention to working on the little people. I think Mr. Hoffman mentioned, or someone mentioned Singapore. And when Singapore, I mean, we know that from the 70s, Singapore was one of the most corrupt countries, and they turned it around, but they arrested the little people. And the little people then were refusing to do the bidding of, the puppet masters, because they were like, yeah, you're my boss, but I'm not going to go to jail for 20 years or be hanged because of what you're asking me to do. So we need to act on all fronts, but not just in terms of fighting corruption, not just in terms of more laws, and attention to prosecution and all that, and investigation, super important, but not the only lever that we can pull. And I think actually trying to address ethics and integrity in the public sector is a lever that no one can argue with, but might actually in the long run bring better results than sporadic interventions on anti-corruption. So thank you for your time, and thank you again to ActionSA for the invitation.
Hey, I'm already fast tracking to Q&A in my own spirit. We have tea at 10:30. It is 10. What time is it? 10:18, 10:17. May I allow Professor Groenewald to do her presentation, and then we'll break straight after that. Is that okay? I think so, because as Dr. Groenewald, because Professor Sope, the juices are flowing, and I think your presentation was a good segue to talk about, whistleblowing, which is what Dr. Groenewald is going to talk about.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, I thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Indeed, also nice to see a few known faces. I was, while everyone was talking, I thought, well, I can just as well, keep quiet, because you have all said what needs to be said in terms of whistleblowing. And I loved your Prof. Reference to that there must be integrity. First, we have so many laws, but it's all about the values that we have within us, but that's another conversation. So I will just, I've always talked about protecting the unprotected. And just want to remind you of a few people. We tend to talk just about one or two the whole time, but this is my dear friend Bianca Goodson, known as one of the first people to blow the whistle on state capture in 2017-16, Trillian and McKinsey. Bianca has not had a job. She's got a master's honors in physics. She hasn't had a job for about 4 or 5 years. No one wanted to employ her. She now finally has contract work. Had gotten divorced. Her child at the end of this whole story was, the child was 4 at the time, but by the time the child was, Chloe was 7, she still had the emotional development of that time, but all is going well. Chloe is good now. Another friend, Johann van Lochenberg, recently robbed of his bike, and I think we all saw the photos in the media of what he looked like. Johann said, sorry, there's just something on the screen. Is that me? Okay. All right, yes. So we all know about Johann. He has written a couple of books, and it has taken a toll on his his whole life, basically. Masilo Mutepo, also trillion whistleblower. At some point, if one reads her book, one will notice that she had only at some stage 4 rand and something in her bank account. She was fortunate that one of the banks actually handed her the deeds of her house eventually. So, but yeah, Masilo is still suffering. She has a job now. Athol Williams, I think we all know what happened to him, not going to elaborate. And Cynthia Stimple, my colleague at the Whistleblower House, SAA whistleblower. Cynthia has also not been able to find a job, although she is highly qualified, and she, well, lost her job. Martha Ngoye, also at the Whistleblower House. Martha is the PRASA whistleblower, those trains that we saw. And Martha is just embroiled in these court cases the whole time, because just as the court says she must be reappointed or reinstated, the next thing, before she can even put her foot back in the office, there's an appeal and she's suspended again. So Martha is still fighting the good fight. And then we tend to forget a couple of people. This is Mas Paku, and he was assassinated in 2009 for speaking up. He was gunned down. He blew the whistle on corruption in the Rustenburg municipality. Yeah. Lennox Garane, he killed himself not far from here in Parliament. He spoke up and he was bullied to the extent Dr. Lennox Garane had actually 2 PhDs. He just couldn't take it anymore. Philemon Ngwenya, no one talks about him. Philemon was the whistleblower for the Vrede Dairy Farm. He was stabbed to death and at his shack where he lived. That was also in 2018. It's the other day. Okay. And then Babita, who has brought all of this to light again. We know that in August 2021, she was assassinated. And in October last year, Marumo Eric Peña was killed in his car, and he is a whistleblower on an IT contract in Home Affairs. And he was killed in his car. The car is still there in Johannesburg, and the car eventually just went off the road and into a tree, if I remember correctly. Only 2 weeks after he died did someone bother to mention it in the newspapers. Okay. And that was that. We never heard anything about him again. So I'm wondering sometimes, are we becoming sort of despondent about all of this? And I really do hope that we can carry this forward, that we can honor these people, all of them, and so many more that I will tell you about in a little while. So corruptus in extremis, that is a word that Bart Simpson actually coined. Okay, so but yeah, so just to look at the numbers, you have mentioned, many of you have mentioned those numbers. What did these whistleblowers do for us, and how much money do we lose? I can't keep ahead of the exact amount of money that we are losing daily because of corruption. But 1.5 trillion lost in corruption from 2014 to 2019. 27 billion lost in corruption 2021. That amount lost in illicit financial flows. 250 million. Thankfully, Cynthia Stimple, she reported it and it was saved at SAA. 322 million, Babita's whistleblowing on what we have actually lost. 200 million, Bain's repayment to SARS. Is that the complete whole amount? Who knows? But at least Athol reported it and it was paid back. Now, are we alone as South Africa in terms of corruption, or actually more in terms of people willing to blow the whistle. The Institute of Business Ethics, based in the UK, did a at-work survey in 2021, and they included South Africa for the first time. And they looked at 13 countries, and I'm now talking about Europe, Australia, Canada, mostly those countries, and then South Africa. And out of the 13 countries, we reported that we observed the most corruption or unethical conduct. Okay, so the question is, participants, have you during the past year observed unethical conduct? And we came first there. Blowing the whistle, people willing to blow the whistle, we came second. People are still willing to blow the whistle in spite of the adverse effects that it has. Satisfaction with the outcome of their report, there we are fifth. And someone mentioned that, you know, when one blows the whistle, you do so to a person or entity that you believe would take action. Now, keep that in mind when you think about the protected disclosure tribunal that has been suggested. Take action. Okay? Something must happen. This is also part of the research. And now many people decide not to blow the whistle, and they are given some reasons. But in South Africa, you can see that 48% of those people who have observed misconduct didn't report it because they feared that they will lose their job. And their fear is a true fear. The second one, 33%, okay, for South Africa, 38% said they didn't want to be a troublemaker. Okay. We are such a loving group of people. 33% said, I didn't believe that corrective action will be taken, so why bother? Another 33% said, I felt I might alienate myself from my colleagues. And you can talk to whistleblowers. Athol will tell you that there was an email sent through Bain to say you are not to talk to Athol ever in your life again. Okay. When Mosile Mutepo walked away from Trillion, she thought she can still count on the friends and the colleagues that she had. No, they all disappeared. I'm dealing with another person who there was strict instruction given to him that he shall never talk again to any of his old colleagues. Problem is, he lives in a town where everyone sort of works at the same place, you know, so there's very few people to talk to. All right, so to me, I did not believe that corrective action will be taken is a matter of trust or a lack thereof in the whistleblowing systems that's in the organizations. And remember, Prof, you said that it's a last resort for people to go outside. I think it was you, yes? They first do their reporting within the organization and then only they go to the media. It's because of that, lack of trust. And then fear for losing their jobs. Yeah, and we know that is true. So some people I've spoken to, one of them said, whistleblower, you get targeted, bullied, emotionally blackmailed, emotional abuse. Everything to get rid of you as soon as possible. Okay. Another one said, if the basic foundation is threatened, food safety, etc., Maslow's hierarchy or pyramid, people won't blow the whistle. Losing your job, basic needs. So are people, let's look at now from statistical point of view. We know people are victimized, but let's have some evidence. And the evidence from this study then is that I don't have all the countries there, the slide isn't big enough, but the average of victimization is on 43% in the 13 countries surveyed. South Africa is below the average, 37%. So more than a third of people who speak up, who finally get that moral courage to stand up, say what they have to say, speak up and challenge. They do that, 36% to 7% get victimized. So are we doing something about it in our organizations? Yes. There are beautiful policies. I write a lot of whistleblowing policies for many multinationals, other private listed companies, and I write them in a way that it is clear for the employees on what they need to do and why they should do it when they blow the whistle. And then our law also requires that they need to be protected from victimization. Great. It's all there in the policy. This policy sets out our approach to protecting whistleblowers. Okay. Protecting from retaliation. Here's another policy. Is committed to ensuring that an individual is not disadvantaged in any way by raising valid concerns. And disadvantaged by dismissal, demotion, loss of benefits, threats, what we call their occupational detriments. In our law, it's called occupational detriments. I call it the unfulfilled promise on organizational level. We go to the country level. Okay, sorry. No, this is first some of the reasons or some of the forms of detriment that whistleblowers in this study suffered. Not going to read through it, but typically is that a person is removed from decision-making powers, that they are abused by their colleagues, that they are being ignored, sent to the Siberian office in the office block, furthest one in the darkest corner on the southern side of the building. Yeah, and my property was damaged. The unfulfilled promise on governmental level, in my opinion, look at all those laws that provides protection or says it provides protection to whistleblowers. We don't need another law, as Prof has said. We really don't. Our problem is that usually, do I have the labor law there? Yeah. It seems that our legal fraternity prefers to use the labor law when they take, or when they, what's the word? Litigate, thank you. Litigate for whistleblowers. And I'm sure there's a very good reason. Maybe the Protected Disclosures Act isn't working. I'm not 100% sure. There are not many good case law in that I know of. I don't know. But what is protection? Is protection by law going to save someone's life? So I'm trying to figure that one out. Maybe I'm missing it completely, and I'll admit if I miss it completely. And okay, so let me just go further. So, and in my capacity as a senior manager at the Ethics Institute, I have been asked to review the public service report, nature, and report on whistleblowing. So, recommendations on what should be done. Good suggestions in there. And you can see I'm calling this slide, people are busy, busier, and busiest. Okay, because they are. I've applied, I'm not sure if I'm going to get it, but at least there's a South African policy support initiative that had a call for experts with the Whistleblower Protection and Support Project. Okay, so it's there. And something is going to happen. It's academics that need to do some research on whistleblower protection worldwide and legislation. I recently gave an input on the protection of whistleblowers in South Africa for the Public Service Commission. So things are going. Minister Lamola said, there's going to be a fund, or we should have a fund for whistleblowers, etc., etc. It's been said for many, many years. And then our president said, whistleblower protection needs urgent review. We cannot let them down. We must and we will ensure that their disclosures result in prosecutions and do more to ensure that they are protected from harm. Okay, the clock is ticking. The Department of Justice is working on legislative framework for whistleblowers, including possibly providing legal assistance for them. Pro bono, I hope. Okay. Our President, the intent of criminals who target whistleblowers is not only to silence particular individuals, it is also to send a message to other potential whistleblowers. Indeed, if I'm going to get gunned down, or no one is going to help me to pay my legal fees, I am going to lose my job. Am I going to blow the whistle? So, in October 2022 already, the President said that the Act must change, as well as the Witness Protection Act. Now, I mean, Advocate, you will know, is that you can only go under witness protection if you are a witness, okay, if you agree to be a state witness. Whereas, it's not many people that do that. All right, so whistleblowers need to receive the necessary protections. I am still wondering how all those things can happen. The possible award to the whistleblower of a proportion of the funds recovered, like in, in Nigeria. There's another opportunity to get some money. And whistleblowers be afforded immunity from criminal or civil action. Yeah, so those are good suggestions. But we must stop being busier and busiest and get, down to it. There was a hard deadline, April 2023. I've just showed you what's happening there. All right. The case of 2 swallows. President and Chief Justice Zondo said that expressed concern about the lack of protection to the whistleblowers, and they are interested, or the President is interested in evaluating the adequacy or otherwise of the protection of whistleblowers. Are we happy? Of course. Let's get there. Now, finally, do we support their views? Yes, by all means. But 2 swallows do not make a summer. So civil society needs to step in so that we can get some action. And one good day in July 2021, Bianca Goodson and I were chatting over the phone. It was a Saturday. And we were talking about everyone saying, we must do something, we must do something. And I said to her, Bianca, let's just do something. Let there just be action. And we established, by that Monday, we registered the Whistleblower House. And dear Ivan Pillay joined us as the 3rd person. So the Whistleblower House, we call it, is a meeting place for courage. And what we do there are 3 legs. We provide support, we do advocacy, and we want to acknowledge whistleblowers. Now, specifically, we support whistleblowers by facilitating access for them to services that they need, such as financial assistance. Some people cannot pay the groceries that they have to put the food on the table. Some whistleblowers do not have money for transport of their children, school fees. So thanks to very generous donors, we can now give these people, when they ask for it, at least, whether it's a 5,000 Rand a month, whether it's a 15,000 Rand a month, to help them just with that bit. We have partnered with a couple of legal firms, big legal firms, who provide their services pro bono to those whistleblowers who need some assistance in that regard, because remember, they don't have money anymore. So how can they afford legal fees? We have partnered with the Psychological Society of South Africa. Many of our whistleblowers want psychological assistance because they have post-traumatic stress disorder. They are depressed. They have anxiety. They cannot sleep. So we get pro bono assistance from a team of Psych South Africa. And also now that we have money, we can pay for additional sessions for them because apparently a minimum of 10 sessions are required. Risk management, we look at the whole family. We have special people in that regard as well who works for us pro bono. And they look at the family as a whole. So are the children in danger? Are you in danger? Your husband in danger, etc. Can we help you to improve the security, your perimeter security? Or do you need to leave the country? Okay. And yeah, I think that's most of the things. And we also provide a platform for the whistleblowers to just talk. And that is mostly through Cynthia Simple. She is our liaison manager, and she supports the people emotionally quite a lot. Our CEO is Ben Tron, and he's doing an amazing job. So just our track record, and I'm not giving this to brag about the Whistleblower House. What I'm saying is that, although I also do that, what I'm saying is that because there is just no help for whistleblowers out there in terms of the legislation, it's beautiful, all those pieces of legislation. And obviously it was written with a good intent. But people, action is needed. Okay? And until such time that us, with our donor funding that we hope to keep on getting, we are really the only organization in the world that is doing this on all these areas. So in February 2022, we launched officially. And these are the stats from then until, April only has 30 days, I know. So in that time, we are now helping, and we've already surpassed that number, 152 whistleblowers. Okay, so I've showed you those faces. No? We know about them. There's 152. Who are they? Who are they? Okay. It's other people that is not in the newspapers who are looking after them. Some people get a lot of exposure. Others don't want it, okay, for good reasons. You can see 134 requested legal assistance, 61 counseling, 38 safety, and 13 some financial assistance. Is legal reform needed? Yes, of course. I think we all know that. Should we include, or should we do a lot of research and get academics on board? Yes. We need the science behind it. And we have to look at the whistleblower laws of all other countries. And I can tell you, everyone is so excited about the European Union, their whistleblowing directive. But our PDA has been there long before theirs. And it basically says the same, with one exception. And I think that is something that we have to take forward in our legislation going forward. I'll talk about those other two now. You see, talk about all the others. What the whistleblowing directive says, they have changed the onus of proof. So if I'm being retaliated against in my company, then the company needs to prove that they did not retaliate against me. Whereas our current law says that I must prove that I have been victimized. I think that would be exceptional. There's one law of ours, is it the Companies Act, that provides that option, but not many take that option in South Africa. All right, so protection measures. Currently, the PDA talks about occupational detriment. And those are the dismissals and the change of terms of service, demotion, suspension, dismissal, those kind of things. Where's the psychological harm, the bullying, the harassment part? Somewhere, I think that should be taken up in a policy, looking at those areas. Standalone agency, yeah, that would be fantastic. Really, it would. Or tribunal. But trust, I think that might be an issue until it has proved itself. Incentivization, that has been a long debate globally. Do we pay people to do good? Johann van Lochenberg is on record saying, no, you don't pay people to do good. Cynthia and many others says, you lose your job, you lose your career, so at least you can be incentivized for that. Okay. Investigation, if a tribunal is going to also be responsible for investigations, we just need to make sure that there's an independence there, okay, that we don't get those tentacles into all sorts of places and people. Yeah, thank you. That's me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Olwethu, you see the extent of your generosity. It has really helped to this end. So I think Klaus, where's Klaus? Oh, okay. So can we do to be democratic or not to be democratic? We'll do your presentation after tea. Absolutely. Okay, that's great. So let's break for tea now. What time is it? It is 10:46. Will 15 minutes be okay, colleagues? Let's do 15 minutes. I'll tell you why. The discussions after are going to be important and we don't want to leave too little time for that. So let's do 15 minutes. We were going to give 30, but let's do 15. Back at 11:05.
sign before you leave. So if you haven't yet, please just let us know and we can bring that to you. If you do need parking validation, I saw the hotel charges quite steeply for parking, so please come grab a ticket from me. And then if you haven't filled out your lunch requirements yet, please make sure, I think Yvette will help you to make sure that you get a little menu and they can choose your lunch option. Is the live stream back on? Okay, great. So over to Klaus that will share the views from the Inclusive Society Institute.
Yeah,
Thanks.
good morning, everybody, and thank you to ActionSA and also to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for seeing the need for this discussion. And I want to start off. I said just before the break, I said I'm going to be short, and I'm going to be short because so much has already been said. I feel really the key points have been addressed, apart from perhaps the one that I'm going to speak to now, and that's the role of civil society. We have heard that, you mentioned that, but coming from the Inclusive Society Institute, which is a small, independent civil society, public policy institute that seeks to build multi-party democracy or to advance the national project. I'd just like to touch on a few topics there. So what do the party, I want to relate back to ActionSA and the party documents that were circulated to us say. Obviously, we know about South Africa's crises, kleptocracy, the need for restore the rule of law, and the zero tolerance approach and building institutions. So all of these are really important. But this is where I'm going to come in and say that we must be very careful of this of a potential overcorrect. Now, what I mean with that is the fact that so much of our deterioration has been associated with individuals. It could be that, again, individuals take it upon themselves to build up a police state, and referring just to individuals such as Minister Liezl, and then, of course, the Groot Crocodile, who did exactly that in the late 70s, where he securitized the state in South Africa. So we must be careful of that, and instead, in the spirit of republicanism, we must build capacity in a democratic way through, we've heard, public-private partnerships, and I think that really is the way that we need to go in South Africa. All of us as citizens must first ensure that the environment around us is free of corruption. That's in our homes, our offices, and really in our daily life. And of course, it must be noted that better protection must be given to whistleblowers, and we've spoken to that, the functioning of a commission that really tackles this problem. And so fighting corruption is foremost a cultural thing, and I want to speak to that culture. We've heard very much integrity being the key theme today, and I want to mention again that a corruption-free society must become the lived reality, not only by the doing of authorities or institutions, but really by each one of us. And so it must be something that must be instilled in every individual from a young age. Again, from the policy documents, I've seen that ActionSA mentioned the need for education, and that is paramount. So the national constitution instills in us not only the rights as citizens, but also the duty of national responsibility. This is something that we at the Inclusive Society Institute focus a lot on, is this activating the constitution and really leveraging the constitution. We heard also earlier about the Bill of Rights, and that this is the true national asset that we have. We must all become active citizens, and that regards reporting crime, abiding by the rules, as we know that we should do it anyways. But corruption is at its core the breaking down of the constitutional project. It is both in intentional ways, as we have seen through treasonous acts, but also in unintentional ways, somebody just trying to get by, leveraging their whatever capacity they have to get ahead. And I think those two obviously work in concert. So a people's response is not a soft response, and it's not a secondary response. It is the bedrock upon which a corrupt free society is built. We see this in every functioning democracy around the world. And since we are sponsored by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and because I spent some time in Germany, I'd like to point out that in Germany, as in other functioning democracies, malfeasance is simply not tolerated by the populace. So I made a note here, culture is power. And it's simple for us to laugh off our problems. It's a very South African thing. We laugh when we're uncomfortable. We laugh because mostly it's because of our trauma, I believe, our inherent trauma. But we must stop doing that. We must stop laughing when tragedy strikes, and instead we must oppose and stand and say, no, we're not going to laugh it off this time. We're going to do what I experienced in Germany, where if you talk about corruption or malfeasance, it's just a straight face and it's like, no, that's not acceptable. So we need to have that culture shift in South Africa. First of all, of course, government has a long way to go. But civil society, we have a huge responsibility to build trust, respect, reciprocity amongst ourselves. And then, this is my last point really, is with government. So again, South Africans are very good at being negative. We are very good at standing around the braai and blaming others. I think entitlement is one of our national things that we do very well. But we need to do things better. And again, this is where culture and where civil responsibility starts. And we need to turn that page. And of course, that's not a matter of sugarcoating or whitewashing or to say that things are okay, really. It's by taking hands and pragmatically working together. And that's what takes me to the point of public partnership or public-private partnerships and the need for that. So as much as government should be blamed and should be pointed to as having been embroiled. If I have my facts right, the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council that was launched by the president at the end of last year could be such a platform for PPP. And even though there's much still to be done, we must recognize it where it is in place. The council must engage business and other stakeholders to develop anti-corruption agenda and evaluate progress. It's there, so now we must activate it. And such participation is not only supported by the UN Convention Against Corruption, so others in the world recognize that and say that partnerships start from the beginning, shouldn't come at the end. This also speaks to constitutional principles and constitutional activation that sees individuals really take this civil responsibility and work in cooperation with government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for that short presentation. Thank you. We are saving some time. Let me now ask my colleague and the former mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay, Mr. Athol Trollip, to ascend to the stage. Thank you, Athol. The other Athol.
Thanks very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm here today to represent ActionSA Senate and obviously the leader of the party in his absence. ActionSA is a new South African party. I'm sure you all understand that. And we're very serious about calling ourselves ActionSA because an acronym like ASA makes us sound like a failed airline. We're not a failed airline, okay? Our political party was born out of dialogue where 2.4 million South Africans made written submissions about whether we need a party and what kind of party we have. So we're very proud of that. And I believe that we're a melting pot of South Africans from all different political persuasions and racial persuasions that have lost faith in the current political establishment, okay? We've become disillusioned with the political establishment. And I really want to thank you for this first session in the build-up to our policy conference, where hopefully we can craft some policies that address the needs of South Africans and policies that are practicable to implement, and that will meet the ideals of our South African dream. And I'm just going to make some reference to that document. You have that document. But essentially, I like to define my re-entry into politics, because there's nothing more ex than an ex-politician or an ex-mayor, okay? So I'm both. But I've re-entered politics because Herman Mashaba challenged me to come and have a meeting with him. And after about 4 hours of trying to convince me, I said to Herman, I said, I've had enough. And he looked at me and he said, have you done enough? Now, that was the most profound question that's ever been put to me about political activism. I live in a broken province, which is part of a broken country, and clearly I haven't done enough, so I'm back in politics. But the one thing I'm not going to do, and my colleagues in ActionSA will no longer do, we're not going to endure anymore. So I really liked what Klaus said about stop enduring. There must be a culture shift. There's certain things that we can no longer just smile about or laugh about when we should be crying about. Even just crying about it doesn't help. So we need to change the way we do things. And, you know, I found this little quote about leadership. Rajen, you were speaking about leadership and integrity. And I'm very proud that one of our core values is ethical leadership in ActionSA, because there's a real deficiency in ethical leadership, not only in government, but also in the private sector, I believe. And this person, Brené Brown, defines integrity as such: choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over fun and easy things, and choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. And I think that that's really important. And thank you, Dr. Groenewald, for showing us the depressing face and the cost of those who chose integrity. I mean, it's depressing. And when you see it starkly put, when you see those faces, it touched me. And then at the end, you told us that there are 150 more that we don't know, who pay the ultimate price for doing the right thing. And then I'm sure all of you have thought a lot about the demise of Tina Jumet-Peterson. And we don't know what happened there. There's speculation, and some people say it was suicide. But time will tell what happened to her. And if it was suicide, why she took her life. If it was something more sinister, we probably know why it happened. It wasn't coincidental that the exposure came, and then a few days later, she's no longer here. So corruption is having a profound impact in our society in South Africa. So we have a document here, if you could just go on the screen. We have a dream in our party about what we'd like to go. Just keep going down. I'm not going to read all of that. I want you to go to the part where it says morally bankrupt leadership. Oh, where is it? There. Okay, so we inherited a broken country, and the ANC failed in their mandate. I don't want to just blame the ANC. Our country is failing, incompetent, corrupt, and negligent leadership. All of those kind of things. And I just want to refer to the fact that corruption is one of the real issues why we fail, why service delivery doesn't work, why people's lives are not improving. It's corruption. It has a profound cost. So I wanted to share some of my experiences. I'm actually a farmer by profession and by choice. That's really what I am. And I got into politics because I served my community. And then I had a long time in politics, and mostly in opposition for 23 years, in fact. And then for 2 years, I was in executive office. I became a mayor. And things started changing in South Africa around 2016. But I want to refer to one of the first people who spoke out about corruption and carrying on doing the way things people were doing. There was Bishop Desmond Tutu in 2011, when he warned the ANC, and he repeated himself 3 times, okay? So that struck me. Then I became the mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay, and there was a guy called Crispian Olva, Chippy Olva, he used to work for the ANC. He wrote a book about how to steal a city. And if you read that book, it's just a microcosm of how to steal a country and how to state capture works, okay? But then shortly after I'd become the mayor, I went to the funeral of Makhenkesi Stofile, former premier of the Eastern Cape. Now, I arrived there, I was probably the only non-ANC person in any kind of leadership, newly elected mayor, felt a bit like a fish out of water, but knew many of the people there. and they were very gracious to me. And I'll never forget Sipho Pitjana speaking at that funeral. And he was one of the first ANC luminaries to speak out. And he used the words of Benson Khubusane, who wrote those words in 1911. And he cautioned the people in that funeral, where he quoted from Khubusane, who said, "Zemkinkomo makwalandini." The cattle are disappearing, you little cowards. Okay? Diminutive, little cowards. And, you know, cattle represent heritage, and cattle represent wealth in Africa. And he cautioned and he spoke out. And there was a brief time where there was Save South Africa initiative, and it just disappeared, okay? And that's really unfortunate. So I often think back on my time as a mayor, and I felt like the proverbial Jack Russell that had caught the bus when I became elected as the mayor. I had no clue how to be a mayor, what to do. Fortunately, I'd run a business and I knew the basics about running a business and making sure that your inlet pipe is bigger than your outlet pipe. And if you do those kind of things properly, you should manage. And I had to try and motivate a whole municipality, my colleagues, my coalition partners, and all of the staff of the municipality to buy into our vision of a new government. And I came up with a metaphor of train tracks. And I described it to all of our colleagues and to the municipality that we were going to run the organization like train tracks. Train tracks are perfectly parallel. They kept parallel and by huge infrastructure of sleepers and bolts and all of that kind of thing. Because if train tracks come together, you have a derailment. And if they come apart, you have a derailment. And you know what was so surprising? My greatest fear was the fact that the officialdom was predominantly ANC because of cadre deployment, and that they would be truculent and obstructive in government, and they weren't. Because for the first time, those people are professionals. They also live in suburbs. They also want streets that are pothole-free with lights. They are just people like anybody else, but they've been put into a dysfunctional system where they can't be professional. And for the first time, they were able to be professional because I said I would keep the politics on the one track as long as the administration kept administration on the other track, and that the two would not intervene and meddle with each other. And you know, we went from being the second worst metro to the second best metro in 1 year. So I'm eternally hopeful that we can turn this situation around because I experienced it for a short time. It can work because people have the same aspirations. But if you're caught up in a quagmire of corruption and intimidation and overbearing instruction and meddling, like people experience from the ANC government, it's very difficult to stick your head out because it gets taken off, like you showed us. So, you know, I learned there that corruption is not an African malaise. It's an ANC curse in this country. Some people make a big mistake and say ANC is African, therefore African is corrupt. It's absolutely not. I saw people rise up, and I listened to you talking about your country and your experiences. It is just a curse of our current government and, you know, a curse in your country, in Nigeria. And you've, Paul, referred to it as a cancerous, it's cancerous and corrosive. Terrible, terrible thing. So to fight corruption, yes, we need whistleblowers, and Dr. Groenewald, you know, apart from the fact that some of the examples don't fill us with hope, the Zondo Commission, our dreadful police, our hawks, the SIU, Whistleblower House is a great initiative. And you know, when you showed us that we weren't the worst in the world, do you know what I felt? I felt like celebrating, okay? I really do, because we come last in so many indexes. But then when you look at, compare us to Spain and France and the UK, I feel like celebrating. So we should tell those good stories as well. So thank you for doing that. But, you know, I learned that fighting corruption requires political will. It requires you to have no fear or favor. It requires courage. It requires patience. Paul Hoffman was saying, he referred to the Glenister case, and, you know, he talked about Mbalula exciting so many people by saying, bring back the scorpions. It doesn't matter what it is and what you call it. If you take the sting out of a scorpion's tail, it's worth nothing. And if you take the claws and a beak, away from a hawk, it means nothing. So those are just the empty promises of the ANC. Paul said it must be independent, anti-corruption body. There must be no meddling, because the ANC allows no independence of state-owned enterprises or Chapter 9 institutions. They're renowned for meddling and for leaning on people. And he said there must be security of tenure, security of employment, and security of life. And at the moment, none of those things apply in our fight against corruption. But there must be proper prosecution. It must be effective, must be efficient, must be resourced. And then there must be followed by incarceration. At the moment, all we ever do is countenance. Never any consequences. Nobody goes to jail. The only person who is in jail is John Block, and he keeps getting prosecuted because they've put him in jail. So give him another sentence. All the others are out. So that's where we fall very, very short. When I was the mayor in Nelson Mandela Bay, there are two examples that I want to quickly refer to. There was the integrated public transport management system, which was the buses that didn't fit on the roads. Talk about trains that don't fit on rails. They bought these buses. They stayed in a compound for about 7 years. We eventually put them on the ground and they started working. But there was a syndicate that was milking the municipality. The charges were laid against them in 2015. It's now 2023 and the court case is going ahead, but it's been going ahead for 2 years. It might go ahead for another 2 or 3 years. Whether anyone will be prosecuted, I don't know. But it just shows you, you've got to have the courage to lay the charges, and then you've got to have the uithou vermoë to hang in there and make sure you get a prosecution. Then there was an organization called Milongani Eco Consulting. And when I appointed a guy called Mongameli Bobani, he was my deputy mayor, he said, he was the only one I asked, what portfolio do you want? Because we needed them in our coalition. And he said, I want public health. And it became clear why he wanted public health, because there was a company called Milongani Eco Consulting. It was a shelf company. It was run by a person in Limpopo. There was no fixed address, but they got every single contract in that department. And then it was farmed out to people who were subcontractors to actually do the work, but they just siphoned money off. So, you know, these people that are corrupt are expert. They are expert. We also have some of the most sophisticated banking systems in the world, because South Africans can steal. Okay, we really can steal. They're expert at infiltrating systems. They are ingenious. They have ingrained people in those systems. They expropriate and exploit the most sophisticated systems to steal. I think about the Public Finance Management Act, the MFMA, the supply chain management, all of those things, almost impossible to steal in the framework of that legislation. But these guys undermine that too by just infiltrating the system, and then they steal wholesale. So those were two examples that really frustrated me, but prosecution is proceeding, and I will do whatever I can in whatever capacity to make sure that those come to fruition. But I also learned, I was kicked out as the mayor after 2 years. I felt very sad, not for myself, but I felt sad for the people of Nelson Mandela Bay, because we were making progress. And then I realized subsequently that we were kicked out because not the people of Nelson Mandela Bay, the people in the council wanted chaos, the preferred chaos. Now, if you think of the most successful predator on the African continent, it's a wild dog. And why are they successful? Because they create chaos. And when you create chaos, you can exploit it. If you have order and progress, you can't steal. And one of the greatest challenges about corruption is not only is money stolen, money isn't properly used. So corrupt organizations don't spend their budgets and they go back to treasury. Why? Because you can't steal without looking over your shoulder. And if you're forever looking over your shoulder, you can't use money properly. And who are the losers? The losers are the poor people who are desperate for service delivery and want their lives to be changed. So when we were kicked out, within 4 days, the new coalition of corruption instituted a contract called drain cleaning. No tender process, no SEM, 25 million rand tender to clean the drains just before Christmas. It was like Father Christmas had arrived in Nelson Mandela Bay, and they handed out this tender, and no drains were cleaned. People were given money, but they didn't distribute it. And once thieves start falling out, they say when thieves fall out, all hell breaks loose. Well, all hell broke loose there, because when it came to dividing the spoils, some people got and some didn't. And 21 people were assassinated in 4 months in Nelson Mandela Bay. 21 people were assassinated, and nobody has been prosecuted or charged or sent to jail. No one. And then, you know, they say that those whom the gods seek to destroy, they first make mad. I live in the Eastern Cape, and I travel a lot between Port Alfred and East London where I live, and there's a pass there called the Kaiskama River Pass. It's a beautiful pass on a beautiful road, and trucks travel very slowly when they go up on either side because it's just quite steep. And there's a protection racket where companies, they don't hide it, are hired to drive behind the trucks going up or down the pass, because if there's no one accompanying the truck, people jump on, they loot it, throw stuff off the truck, and then the truck can't stop because it's too steep and all the rest. So there we have daylight highway robbery. You know, if you read about the old days, you had highway robbery. We have highway robbery happening on a daily basis. There are no police. You've got private companies that run a protection organization to protect trucks on our roads. Now, that is the pits as far as I'm concerned. You should be able to trust water coming out of a tap without contracting cholera. You should be able to trust the roads that you travel on to get your goods to a certain point so that the economy can grow and you can create jobs. We are at a point in South Africa where nobody can trust anything. No infrastructure, no criminal protection, no fight against corruption. And we, as ActionSA, have said, we've had enough. Sitikiwe. And we will not countenance and tolerate it anymore. You know, we spoke about Michaela Wrong, and it's our time to eat. Mwai Kibaki appointed a guy called John Gitongo as the Minister of Anti-Corruption. It was the first time on the African continent. He didn't last long. They hounded him out of that country because people don't have an appetite to really combat corruption. Corruption does not happen in a vacuum. Rajen Naidu said that. It's not just in public institutions, it's in our private institutions, but it denudes the public purse. It compromises value for money. It compromises service delivery. And I want to conclude by saying there have been incredible examples of success in how to fight corruption. None better than Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew had 3 words that defined his presidency. Yes, he was a benevolent dictator, but yes, he was the only person to take his country from a third world country to a first world country in less than 2 decades. The 3 words were meritocracy, where he said, find the right person and the job will be done. Pragmatism, got to be pragmatic about problems. All the old isms, communism, socialism, liberalism, nationalism, they all are passé as far as I'm concerned. Pragmatism is the one. What is the problem? How are we going to do it? And who's going to do it? By when? And if they don't do it, what are the consequences? That's pragmatism. And Deng Xiaoping described it best as far as I'm concerned. He said, it doesn't matter what the color of the cat is, black or white. If it catches mice, good cat. We need to start thinking like that in South Africa. But unfortunately, we see everything through a racial prism. Everything through a racial prism. And then the last one that defined his success is honesty. If we're not honest in this country, we can forget about winning the war on corruption. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Athol. You get...
To be very remiss of me if I didn't thank Konrad Adenauer Stiftung.
Yes.
Everybody else has done it, but we as ActionSA, the Senate, the leadership, we really appreciate your role, your support, what you're going to do with us going up to the policy conference. And without your support, we would never be able to have this kind of event. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I wanted to say that you get the Nobel Prize for beating the president of ActionSA for speaking longer than what is required. But thank you very much. We thought we were safe from Herman, but clearly he follows us everywhere. Johann?
Okay, thank you all so much for sharing expertise with us. I think, like Klaus said, it's hard to think of things that we might have missed because I think the discussion this morning has been so comprehensive. Dirkie, if you guys can throw up that presentation real quick. So what I've tried to do, and probably done quite poorly, is try and capture visually all these things that we've discussed this morning, just to show how all of this is interrelated. And corruption definitely does not happen in a vacuum, and the impact of corruption doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I don't expect you to be able to read all of that because it's quite small, but this is how we kind of view the policy system in South Africa. And the idea of these kind of interlapping circles is to show that everything works or has a link to each other. So corruption has an impact on our law and order. When we talk about the breakdown of trust, that's obviously, and the example that's being set by our leaders when they are corrupt, that doesn't set a environment where people want to be ethical because they see politicians being rewarded for the unethical behavior. And it just has, you know, we are very clear on it that it has an impact on our energy security, and that in turn has an impact on our climate and environment. So these things have massive knock-on effects, and we should never try and see it as something that happens in isolation. It is all interrelated, and even education. One of the saddest metrics where we come in last is our education system, and our poll study came out recently, and 82% of grade 4 learners 10 years old can't read for meeting, and corruption has a big part in that, in the role of how the education department has been captured. So these things are super important, and if you can please, so basically it just goes to show that we have to view this as a system, and that requires complexity, leadership, and change management over the next decades. And it's going to take decades for South Africa to improve. This harm that has been done to our country is not going to change overnight within one election cycle. Yes, can you please go to the next slide? So this is once again, a poor attempt of trying to capture what we've discussed this morning. And I try to do this just to show again that these things all have an impact in each other. And it's a system that we need to change. Because we've talked about private sector corruption, we've talked about partnerships and the role of civil society, but that also means that our corporates need to step up and ensure that their behavior is ethical and go beyond just regular CSI measures and the King Code of Governance. They need to voluntarily take responsibility for contributing to the improvement of South Africa. We talk about the democratic processes, and I think Klaus talked about active citizenry, which I think is so important. If I recall what was discussed at the News 24 Summit and the gathering and many conferences that I've attended the past while, it's always about we are the people that need to change the system. It is up to us, and us includes all South Africans. It's not just political parties. It's not just experts. It's everyone needs to step up, and we need to work towards a shared vision for a better South Africa. We talk about government and public procurement, and Prof. Williams talked about the recruitment practices and how that impacts organizational culture. We look at the institutions, and I think Paul's STIRS acronym is fantastic to view how we change the institutions that are involved with not only combating but preventing corruption. We've talked about whistleblowers, and Liezl very powerfully mentioned by name people that have lost their lives and people that have suffered great personal loss in terms of losing their jobs because of doing the right thing, and that's something that clearly needs to change. We talked about integrity and ethics and how we can try and improve that across society, and not only politicians or government officials, because corruption often happens in the public procurement system where private companies are using their political links to drive corrupt practices. So it requires bravery as well in leadership. And then the final thing is leadership. And I think when we think about improving South Africa, we need to think about the fact that there's no single leader that's going to save us from ourselves from the current situation. It's going to take thousands of leaders across society to work together towards a shared vision. And that's politicians, business leaders, civil society leaders, community leaders, academics. It's really even faith-based organizations that need to get involved. So it's really a collective effort that we need to make as a society that cares about South Africa. And I think that's also quite clear. South Africa has the expertise. I've been engaging over the past 3 years with hundreds of South Africans, and
South Africans are exceptionally talented people and caring and really interested in improving the country, but unfortunately we are stuck with a leadership that is not on the same page as the rest of society, and we need to do something about that. So with that being said, we're going to open the room for discussion. I'd like to kick us off with a question from, we've asked some of our student members to send in some questions, and we've been engaging with people online and kind of looking what they asked. So I'm going to pose a question from Daniel Akumdad, and with perspective that, you know, Athol just mentioned pragmatism, and I think we need to be realistic in South Africa, that the challenge is massive, the resources are limited, but the urgency is huge. So we need to talk about what solutions there are that we can achieve both in the short term and the long term. So with that, Daniel's question, he's a student at the University of Cape Town, and he asks, how can South Africa ensure that ethics are deeply ingrained and upheld in its ongoing efforts to combat corruption, particularly within public institutions? And what role can education and awareness play in promoting a culture of ethical behavior among public officials and citizens alike? And I like that question because I think we discussed the role of education and voter education to truly understand the impact of corruption. Rajen, I don't know if you would like to kick us off on that question. Thanks.
Thank you, Johann. I think to start with, there needs to be a solid understanding of the term integrity. I think this issue, the induction issue at any public institution, should be a critical issue in inducting, especially new employees, because I don't think enough is done currently to sensitize and to familiarize new employees with the issue of corruption, the consequences of corruption, and how innocent employees can unknowingly get involved in corrupt acts via manipulation, etc. So I think the induction phase is critical for me. I think that should play a critical role in educating new employees, and I think that should be the first and foremost step in addressing that issue. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think I'm gonna get off my laurels, and there we go.
Thank you. If I can just also weigh in. There's an integrity management framework for the public sector, and there's a whole host of things that departments need to do. One of it is to appoint a certified ethics officer. Certification is done by the Ethics Institute in association with the Stellenbosch University Business School. The problem, and I told Prof earlier, is there are many people who attend that course so that they can go back to their department and become the ethics officer or the integrity manager. There are many names. And then part of the program would be to do the induction, would be to do anti-corruption training and those kind of things. Unfortunately, I think that, you know, they are so excited when they leave the course and then they get back to their department and they just lose, you know, there's so much pressure on them. Let me just put it that way. So there are actually something in place. It's written on paper. And some public institutions try, and they send people and they have their framework and they have all of those things. They're training, their awareness, their whistleblowing hotline, etc., etc. But they are sometimes met with opposition.
Thanks very much. Actually, let me move to the front. There's a lot that has come out of these discussions. There has been this idea in South Africa, and I liked what you said about we laugh about everything. The question I have, and I have this for Paul and everybody else who's here, but it came out of your presentation. South Africans tend to compare the current goings on to the previous one. So now, meaning that the Boers are also eating. So our turn to eat moment. Is there such a thing or concept as constructive corruption? I'm just asking that because it's doing the rounds, and maybe we should, frame it in a way that people can understand whether or not, can people be corrupt and still provide services?
I don't believe so. So I just, in response to that question, and I've answered your question, I don't believe there is such a thing. You're either honest or you're dishonest. You're either pregnant or you aren't. There's no gray lines there. I wanted to just say, though, as long as we have a system in this country where there is no consequence to malfeasance, we're not going to deal with the issues of that question. So let me use two examples. There's a breakdown of trust in our own systems. How does a guy like Thabo Bester, who doesn't have an ID, have a bank account? Okay? So that means the banking institutions that you were talking about, private institutions, they're all complicit in corruption. So that's one of the issues. And then, I think that apart from the fact that our kids can't read in grade 4 with any kind of understanding, the best way to change people's behavior is to start with children. I remember when we used to drive without seatbelts. It's not the beeping of the seatbelt that makes you put it on, because you just slip it behind your back and you can carry on. It's when your kid says to you, but you can't drive without a seatbelt. It's not the nagging of your wife who says you can't drive because you've had 3 beers, and you say, well, I've been driving this route for the last 30 years after 5 beers. She won't make you stop driving. But when the kid sitting in the back says, Dad, you can't drive after having more than a beer, who's going to argue with a child? So we need to start training our children at schools, because we're already so entrenched. Those people that go to your integrity course, they go back to an entrenched system where even if they want to, it's too late to learn ethics and integrity when you're an adult. You need to learn those things. They say values are caught, they're not taught. You cannot teach values to an adult about integrity if they have no idea what integrity and ethical behavior is growing up.
The science on this topic is very interesting. I learned this from Stellenbosch University, Professor Gavin Woods, who was in that ACERIS unit at the time. In any given big population, 10% of the people are absolutely incorruptible, like everybody in this room. 10% of the population are always corrupt because they're just like that. They're the sociopaths and the psychopaths and the bad eggs. And 80% in between can go either way, depending on the circumstances in the society in which they live. So when you are considering a culture of ethics in any society, you have to recognize that if the society that you are working on has a strong culture of corruption with impunity in place, it is very difficult, short of locking up those who are involved in the actions that should not enjoy impunity, to inculcate ethical standards in that population. So if you're looking for a quick fix in South Africa, where there is a huge culture of corruption with impunity, the quickest solution is to put in place effective and efficient anti-corruption machinery of state, so that those in the society who are toying with the idea of joining the ranks of the corrupt see that corruption with impunity is now a thing of the past, and that big shots are getting locked up for doing it, and that little people are getting locked up for doing it. Then you will be able to make some headway in a society in which integrity and ethics are in place, rather than endangered species in the makeup of that society. So to my way of thinking, and it's probably because my background is in law, forget about trying to fix the ethics until you have fixed the law enforcement system. And that's not difficult to do, because the Constitutional Court has given us the recipe, and all we need to do is bake the cake. And everybody should be behind that. I would call on ActionSA. See, I got it right that time. I would call on ActionSA to get behind the idea, or to improve on the idea, that we have been punting as accountability now since that judgment in 2011. That is the way to get to the sort of society that the poor people in South Africa expected when we were liberated in 1994 and deserve in 2024.
Thank you. Professor
Okay.
Sope?
Thank you. And thank you to whoever asked the question. So I'll say a couple of things. In terms of how do we, inculcate ethics in the public sector. And I'll reiterate what I said earlier about giving attention and intention to the culture in our public organizations. When you're talking about ethics officers going back, it's because they went back to a counterculture. So no matter what they learned and how well that they were trained, it doesn't matter because they're now a fish out of water, okay? And if whether we have more laws or less laws, it's people that are implementing those laws, and people are the formal aspects of our system. So the laws, the policies are actually not as important as the informal and the intangible. So if we don't give attention to the informal culture, behavior, if we don't give attention to that and we focus on the formal, we're playing a losing game. The idea of education, for me, education in schools is important, but I feel like education begins at home. And so I'd ask people sometimes when I do my training, what is the message your kids are receiving from you, right? If the message your kids are receiving, and that's the unspoken message, is, kids don't do what you do, they do what you say, they do what you do. So if the unspoken message is that, if we can fudge things, you lie a little bit on this form for their school, you sign things you're not supposed to sign, and the kids see that and they get a message that it's okay to, the end justifies the means. So it's like, what do we tell our kids? What do our kids believe about integrity and honesty? Now, I agree that adult behavior cannot be changed, but with the right incentives, it can. If I know that if I mess up, I'm going to lose my job, no matter what I want to do, then I know what's important to me, and I'll make what's an economically rational decision. So again, back to our culture, back to what do we incentivize? The issue about whether countries can be corrupt. So I'll have a slightly different perspective from Athol. Now, I think like a country like China, it's not, I don't think they're a model of honesty or ethics. But what China has that seems to be working in its favor is that they have, as much as a country can, a common vision. And that kind of acts as a guardrail on their corruption, because there is corruption in China, right? And that's, because they're so devoted to solving their own problems, even when there's corruption, the corruption is not a wild dog. It's like they know if someone takes a contract, even if they pay a kickback, they know that they must execute that contract and execute it properly. So the bribes are paid, make no mistake, but the work still gets done. But we take the bribe. There's this joke that Thuli Madonsela always tells about an African minister and an Asian minister, and the Asian minister shows him, that joke she tells about, says, okay, you see that hospital, and there's a small hut, and they're like, oh, I took 50% of the contract. And then the African minister takes the Asian minister to his country, and it's like, you see that hospital? He's like, no, I can't see anything. He's like, 100%. Right? So there's no hospital, So that's the problem with our kind of corruption, is that ours is the worst form of cancer, is stage 4. Whereas in other countries, it's still stage 1 or stage 2. There's still, kind of hope. So but not to say that we should tolerate it in any form, because we don't have, South Africa is divided as you can be, right? We don't have the kind of system that can put guardrails on the way we behave, especially when it comes to dishonesty. So I'll say that I feel we need to think about culture, and I'll keep saying that, because those informal elements determine the direction we're going to go, whether we like it or not.
Thank you, because that was my actually the reasoning behind the question, can we be constructive? And I think that's where we're going with the fact that once our corruption kicks in, you want instant millionaires and billionaires without necessarily, in fact, in the municipality, they talk about how we've outsourced what needs to be done. So now all the expertise that are in municipalities have left. And so we now are making more billionaires outside of municipalities because they formed or started their own consultancies. And so they charge the municipality all of that money, and then nothing gets done. So that's where I was going with that question, whether or not we can do it constructively. Go ahead.
Add to that, I think to speak to that matter of constructive corruption is, I think in South Africa we push it under the table and say no, of course not. But we forget that this phrase that is now returned to public domain, that matter of it now it's my time to eat. We forget that it's not just nefarious. It's really people that don't have anything to eat that become embroiled in these situations, and so I think we must see that our country is to such an extent unsustainable. I mean, we speak in our organization as inclusivity, but anybody that travels South Africa would see that materially we are unsustainable, and if we don't change that, we're facing existential crises. So those of us that can do must do more. That's my point of departure. And what have we seen since the dawn of democracy? We have seen those that have benefited. It doesn't matter what color of the skin. They have built higher walls. They have excluded. They have got their private security. They have put in place things that can appear to be benefiting their security, but yet. I forget now, but somebody pointed out quite recently that dictum of when you are putting up a wall, a higher wall, you're just delaying the inevitability. But instead, we must seek creative, constructive ways of really addressing this really existential threat of having an unsustainable society. And social justice is, I think, what must be put right at the forefront. Tuli Maracela, of course, speaks to that very much. Yeah, exactly. So again, we must be creative in our civil activism and contribute in ways that we might have to take the knock now, but see a longer picture. So I think South Africa, again, because of our traumas of the past, we've been very much blighted by history and by not being able to take a longer scope. The Chinese, they everything is 2049. So really, what happens today? Does it advance us towards 2049? And I like the South African dream, because that's in essence what the Chinese say. They talk about the Chinese dream. And it's more than just about the individual. So if I have to, in South Africa, we, again, those of us that can, we kick back against taxes and these kind of social responsibilities. And it is tricky, of course. It's, you leverage high taxes and people move their money abroad and so forth. But again, this is where culture needs to change. And we need to see the goal of social justice as really the primary destination that we're moving towards, because that's in everybody's interest. It's again, it's not, you don't have to build that high wall when the person who's going to be jumping over that wall doesn't need to jump over that wall, because they can feed themselves, because it really is a matter of being fed. So we don't have to wait for the politicians to, it's now our time to eat, because it really is, some people don't have their time to eat.
Fantastic. Thank you. No, that's fine. I'm going to take one question, and I'm going to ask you to carry on with the student questions. Do we still have robust questions from students? Okay. So please go ahead, sir.
I just want to have a few questions. I'll try to. Okay. My name is Mapanga Maseko. I'm a loyal, dedicated member of ActionSA in Western Cape. I've got a few questions. I'll try to make them as quick as I can. The first one is, yes, yeah, the first one is to Rajen. You spoke about leadership, that the issue of corruption connected to leadership. What is the most practical way of giving a solution to leadership crisis in South Africa. Does it mean that we don't have good leadership? We don't have good leaders? But practically, how do we solve the leadership vacuum in South Africa? Because you said that it is connected to corruption as well. The second question is for Paul. Yeah.
So can you ask the question to Paul and have Paul answer it before you continue with the next question?
Yes, okay. You said, okay, thank you for making presentation to parliamentary committee. I want to find out from you, is there any legal way to force the parliamentary committee to make a decision quite fast instead of delaying the process? And two, how do we as the community and political parties help you to intensify the battle for that process?
I think there is a way. I'm not sure if I'm on, okay. There is a way, and the way is to litigate the non-implementation of the binding decision made in Glenister 2. You can't just ignore a court order and pretend that it's not there, which is what has happened. But since the report of the Zondo Commission, there is now solid evidence that the anti-corruption machinery of South Africa is not working as it should. And therefore, it is possible to go back to court and say, we would like an order compelling the government to bake the cake according to the recipe that was given in 2011. How do the people active in politics assist? That is by getting behind the call for the establishment of a Chapter 9 anti-corruption commission. We already have the IFP and the DA on board with that. We believe that some of the smaller parties will also see it that way because it's good politics to be in line with the rule of law, which you see in the first bullet point that Cass puts up for us to look at. And it is also in line with South Africa's obligations in respect of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, especially number 16, which talks about strong institutions of state, which you don't have if you're in a situation where institutions that should be strong are actually weak. So if there was a united voice from all opposition parties in South Africa saying, get on with the job, that may save the need for the litigation.
Thank you.
Did I answer both?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Please forgive me. I had a prior engagement and I shoehorned you in today. But I must move on. I have a country to save.
Well, thank you to Paul. Let's give him a round, colleagues. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, he just whispered some sweet words in my ear there. Go continue.
Okay, he's gone now. I wanted to ask him that, but it's fine.
I think the colleagues here can take it. Just
Okay.
carry on.
Okay, yeah. The follow-up question will be, there is an argument that corruption is linked to inequality and poverty. Some of the corrupt activities that we are encountering and seeing in South Africa are occurring as a result of inequality and poverty. So some argue that you cannot address corruption unless you first deal with inequality and poverty. So my question to the panelists will be, what will be the most effective way of addressing poverty and inequality in order to deal with corruption? And then the last question which I have is for Athol Trollip, will be, do you know, in the Western Cape, we have a challenge where we are always told that where the DA governs, everything is well. Meanwhile, we're experiencing corruption almost on a daily basis, but it is not reported as much as corruption in the ANC-led municipalities and government departments. For example, yesterday or today, there's this guy from KwaZulu-Natal who's ANC oligarch, it's Mudli, who actually took Daily Maverick to court and got the court order for Daily Maverick not to publish some article recently. And now today it came out that the very same person was awarded a 282 million tender by the Western Cape government. And I can guarantee you the media will not focus on that one because it happens in Western Cape, where the perception that everything or the DA governs, everything is well. So my question to Athol Trollip is, well, how do we deal with that, where the perception is that everything that happens within the DA-led municipalities and government is okay? How do you expose that corruption effectively without the support of the media?
Okay, so I'm going to allow Athol. I think he's asking that because it has a DA flavor in it. However, I'll allow you to take it in part, but I'm going to ask Dr. Groenewald because I think her presentation kind of answered it very well in my view. I'm going to ask you to come back to it because I think it's not necessarily DA led or whatever. It's just talking about the idea that you can deliver services even as you are being corrupt. I think that's what he wants to get to, so that we demystify that issue. Can I ask you to ask your question?
Yes, I'm Christina Smith from the ActionSA. I'm on the Provincial Executive Committee of the Western Cape. I've got a question actually for Professor Williams. One thing, first of all, I want to say that it's not just the poor who are corrupt. And I'm thinking back to maybe 20, 30 years ago when my daughter was a teenager and her boyfriend, once my husband paid for a meal for us all, and her boyfriend asked him for the receipts that he could claim from his firm for entertainment. And I said to him, I remember saying at the time, this is how corruption starts. Also, it's bribing a policeman when so it's right through. It permeates everything. Now, what I was wondering about education and corruption and trying to get that 80% of people who could be swayed either way. Our country is very religious, and all the great faiths have this very strong underpinning thing of integrity and goodness and things, caring for other people. Now, to what extent can we mobilize the religious faiths in this country to help with this business of educating people in ethics, about integrity, about corruption? This is not in any way ignoring the problems of, like, for example, the poor and their need to steal just in order to survive. You're on top of that. And I think maybe you could, Professor, you could maybe answer something along those lines.
When the churches too can be corrupt or led by corrupt leadership, Athol?
Yeah, look, first of all, how do we deal with poverty and inequality? I think that's the challenge that we have in our country. It's a massive issue. And if I can use the Western Cape, because you come from the Western Cape and lead up to your question, the Western Cape is no doubt the best run province. Many of the municipalities are some of the best run municipalities. So the claim to be able to govern well by the DA is probably correct. But the Western Cape is also overrun by people who are part of a record urbanization and migration of people away from failed states and municipalities and provinces, like the Eastern Cape where I come from. So well-run and overrun is going to be a big issue, and you will have the disparity that we see daily. So it's a massive challenge. Corruption is endemic in South Africa, so the DA is not immune from corruption. It's definitely not immune. And it won't, it's not going to stop as long as people turn a blind eye or it's politically expedient not to act against a colleague. And that's where corruption flourishes, because if you rely on a colleague to give you support, you countenance something, you turn a blind eye, and before you know it, you're sucked into that vortex of corruption. So I saw it recently in Kocha municipality in the Eastern Cape. That's a DA-run municipality. There was an ANC councillor who had missed a whole year's worth of council meetings, but nothing happened until finally they couldn't countenance anymore. And he was about to be expelled. He resigned, and the next day he was employed on a contract by the DA-led government. So the questions have got to be asked, why would you employ a guy who can't come to work as a councillor to work in the municipality as an official? He's going to even less chance of coming to work. So it's about countenance. And we as a society need to adapt or adopt a zero tolerance attitude towards corruption. But there's a perfect example. And I didn't know where you were going to go when you said it's not a poor thing. Corruption is definitely not a poor thing. In fact, it's a rich thing. It's a greed thing. It's the rich that are really corrupt. My experience is that poor people aren't corrupt. They just exist and they do whatever and they're ethical, and it's the rich that are corrupt.
Thank you so much. I just want colleagues to ponder whether or not our public anger is insufficient. If somebody can speak to that. Did you want leadership? Okay.
Thank you very much. I think just before I go on, I think what the gentleman was referring to in his question regarding the security contract was, and correct me if I'm wrong, the owner of the company is from KZN. He's closely associated with Jacob Zuma. He's also a benefactor of many state capture tenders. And I think your question was, how is it then that he managed to get into the Western Cape with about a 232 million rand contract? I think that was more his question in line. Given I think the guy's name is Roy Modley, if I'm not mistaken. And I think given his track record, one would expect the Western Cape government to look with more scrutiny at a vendor like that. But I stand to be corrected. I don't know what really transpired there. But just to clear that issue and what the gentleman actually asked. Coming back to your question to me regarding leadership in government and how do we address it, I think before I go on, I should have said this from the beginning when I did my presentation, but let me say it now. I've spent about 3 decades in government as a civil servant. A vast majority of that time was spent in the anti-corruption environment, in anti-corruption units, fighting fraud and corruption, as a forensic investigator, and thereafter heading the forensic investigative team in the Department of the Premier here in the Western Cape for 10 years. And my opinion of leadership is very simple. It starts with people being appointed in leadership positions who genuinely lack integrity. And they are blindly appointed simply because many of them are political appointments. And they hold the highest level in any, let's say, provincial government or even at national government. It starts there and it filters all the way down. And the more senior positions you get, the more you find that these appointments are political. And what happens is, to give you a very simple example, at provincial level, if you have a person standing up against corruption, speaking out about it, and if you have a leader that doesn't buy into any anti-corruption policy or mechanism, they're going to shoot that individual down. And if that individual is a victim of circumstances, etc., he's going to report it to HR and maybe to labor relations components. And what will happen is that, or what normally or generally happens, is that those two key components, HR and labor relations, are captured by those corrupt senior managers who don't want to see anything fair done in a process like that or in any sort of complaint. So I think what needs to happen is that, firstly, these managers, most of them are senior managers, and most of them are bound by senior management service contracts. but you find often there's no action taken against them. They're not held accountable against those contracts. Those contracts sometimes are there just for show. And they only pulled out to be used against an individual if you want to deal with that individual for some other reason, be it political or otherwise. And I think we need to go to those performance agreements more often. And then also, the abuse of power becomes so rife that maybe the Public Service Commission, and I mentioned this once before in the Anti-Corruption Summit, should actually look at attaching the pensions of certain government employees, especially senior managers, who are negligent in the performance of their duties, who conduct themselves in such a negligent and reckless way that they result in litigation against the department. And the two most common departments that I can think about is the Department of Health and the police. So I think we need to start attaching their pensions, and that would be a major deterrent on its own. Thank you very much. I hope that answers your question.
Very progressive. Do you want to take it, or should I give it to Athol in the meantime? You're happy? Okay. Okay.
I'm just going to be very quick because you reminded me, Rajen, of something. So first of all, it's not just Roy Moodley. There was Edwin Sodi, who got a contract to fix the Rooiwal water treatment works in Tshwane. It wasn't fixed. 270 million rand later, people are dying of cholera. Now, those are the stories that South Africans need to understand. That is the impact of corruption. Okay, so why did the DA appoint Edwin Sodi, who had a really bad track record? And the consequences of that rotten deal is that people are dying. But I think also what we need to start, so you were talking about, you know, a dearth of leadership and exemplary leadership. My campaign to become the mayor in Nelson Mandela Bay was based on two promises: that I would stop corruption and grow the economy. My deputy mayor was corrupt. I had 5 meetings with the DA and the UDM to try and deal with it. They wouldn't deal with it. Eventually, I fired him as an MMC. I couldn't fire him as the deputy mayor because councillor had appointed him. I fired him as the MMC because I'd made a promise to stop corruption, not to slow it down or to mitigate it or whatever. So I couldn't countenance him being there, knowing that as soon as I fired him, he would vote against us and I would no longer be the mayor. Those are the consequences. You've got to take tough choices. You make a promise to stop corruption, you've got to stop corruption, even if it means you lose your job. So we need more of those kind of examples.
What do we consider treasonous in this country? I'm just asking, especially when you're suggesting, Rajen, the attachment of people's pension, and I tag that onto public anger. What do we consider treasonous in this country? Why did I come here, by the way? Did I come? Did you want to say something? Okay.
So that's going to be a long. Now, I just wanted to add to the previous discussion is that, Paul told us about the 10-80-10%. We always call the 80% of people in the in between as decent but dubious. Okay, so they can become dubious. Yes. So, but what I wanted to say, so when asked about, the DA here, and I'm standing completely outside of politics, is that we must remember that not everyone is corrupt. It's individuals. It's not everyone in the country. And we must focus on the good people. And there's one thing that I always do in organizations is this kind of an exercise of translating the organizational values into behavior. So we are talking about integrity. Everyone must have integrity. But what does it mean for you? What does it mean to me? We must get a common understanding because in some of our languages, there isn't even a direct translation from integrity into one word. So having integrity up there on a poster, is it going to help? No. So we have to translate the values or the Constitution's values, because the Constitution is a values-based document. And then what one needs to do is to not just be reactive. yes, of course, people must be held accountable. And please, can they just be held accountable for once? That will really help because it will serve as a deterrent. But we have to be proactive. And by that proactive, I think of creating awareness in our communities, any community, creating or educating people again through what does corruption mean? What are examples of corruption? The person seeing or the child seeing mum forging a document or a signature doesn't necessarily realize, this is wrong, because so we have to create that awareness. And I was thinking, if you remember a long time ago with HIV/AIDS, and people were not quite, sure what it is and so on. They were in the clinics, posters and documents and booklets and strips and you name all of those wonderful things handed out to the communities. And look where we are now from that time, what's it, 20, 30 years ago, to where we are now. Why can't we do the same with this pandemic?
It's called corruption.
Yes.
All right. Okay, Professor Sope.
I just wanted to answer your question. So I think there was a question on poverty and inequality and corruption. And corruption, poverty and inequality don't cause corruption. Corruption actually exacerbates poverty and inequality. So there's poverty and inequality in every society. Obviously South Africa's history made, has given that, color lines and all that. But corruption makes it worse because when money for social grants or social goods are deflected, when people can no longer have faith in public hospitals or in public schools, then of course the gap between the haves and the have-nots will widen. And I agree with Athol that corruption is not really a poor person's problem. Poor people don't have access to resources to steal them anyway. So in terms of faith-based organizations being co-opted into the fight against corruption, I agree that would be useful. I think one of the challenges you have, maybe especially in some, let me speak from Christian churches, because that's where I have most experience, is that they don't always give the right messages because that message is not popular to the biggest donors. So again, the culture has influenced, what the doctrine should be. And again, so going back to, what kind of society are we building from our homes? What kind of culture are we allowing? Because even though a lot of the time I find that people feel that things are happening to us, that we are passive victims, but we're not, because I feel like in our own little way, everyone is making a choice every day as to whether or not they will push against corruption or they would just, permit it. And that permission is also a choice. So yeah, I think it would be good if faith-based organizations could come to the party, but not all of them are. Some of them do, but not all of them do enough because it's not in their own self-interest.
Thank you, Professor.
Awesome.
A student question?
Yeah, thank you so much for all those inputs. I'm going to ask another question from Sesona Kreda from University of Cape Town. We all understand that the impact of corruption on socio-economic development is significant. How can South Africa leverage international cooperation and partnerships to combat corruption, share best practices, and learn from successful anti-corruption models implemented in other countries? Olwethu, I was wondering whether I can direct that to you. And I want to frame that as well within the context of South Africa being grey-listed and our insufficient response to issues like money laundering, monitoring people's couches, the illicit financial flows. How can we, from that kind of perspective, from the, let's call them professional criminals almost, that often use shell companies, how can we better improve in that perspective, and how can we better cooperate with international agencies? What is kind of the latest thinking in terms of how technology plays into that? Is it something like beneficial ownership transparency? So if you can just a little bit elaborate on that quite technical side of corruption. Thanks.
Read my mind. I was coming to you anyway.
Thank you. That's a very important question, but also very complex to unpack. As you've just mentioned, it's a web of numerous issues. And Athol had mentioned that political will is the most important thing, especially when you're dealing with international actors, because South Africa needs to be open to that input. International actors can't exactly impose themselves onto the country and its institutions. That's a big debate about coercion and colonial powers and so forth. So people are a bit more cautious in terms of saying they're imposing restrictions or obligations on countries. And even now, we also have bad reactions, for example, to sanctions from FATF currently as a grey listed country. There are various views about whether that is being the country being controlled by external actors. So I think South Africa needs to come to the conversation on their own. And I think also we have our civil society organizations who need to shed the light and say, listen, there are international partners who can assist. There are various organizations who do fund research. I think there's a lot more research, especially in the universities, where there are young minds who are more open to saying, this is an international effort, actually. South Africa can't do it on their own. There are lots of lessons that we can learn from countries that are more successful, not only in the West, but the global South has also made a lot of progress. Countries in South America, such as Colombia. I spoke to UN officials who said, listen, Colombia doesn't need us. They have taken ownership of their development. They have built the institutions to fight crime, and they're actually paying us, and they are allowing us to help their neighbors. That's the extent to which they have done so much to repay the damages that they've suffered. So it's a very important debate. It's still ongoing. The Global South, I think, is getting there. I think there's momentum. Obviously, Global South, the West, Africa, it's becoming a global discussion. So we are getting there. There is hope, I would say.
All right, let's take another student question.
Sorry, can I just have a comment about that question?
Let me come to you, Athol. While you gather your thoughts.
I think it's going to just reinforce what Ms. Majola has just said. But, when President Ramaphosa became president, he dubbed the 9 wasted years of Jacob Zuma. And there was this Ramaphoria at the time, and everyone believed that he was going to do something about corruption, and it's been another 6 wasted years. So the political will is clearly not there from anyone in the current government. But I think political will starts with us. To answer the question from the student, starts with us, Ekaya, here at home. Because Ms. Majola has just said Colombia took ownership of their own stuff, and then things start changing. They don't need us, was what she just said. So we actually need to start at home. Stop looking somewhere else to countries that have failed more miserably than we have, that we saw on the board there. Start fixing it at home ourselves and find examples that we can celebrate and talk about.
No, yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think if we speak specifically to the grey listing issue, it came as a surprise to no one. It's something that we knew was going to happen long in advance, and about 2 or 3 months before the actual grey listing deadline, that's only when Parliament introduced very flawed legislation. So it's, even with those warning signs, it's the attention, the focus isn't on the right things. It's about eating, I guess. Okay, so this feeds into leadership, but I'm going to ask a question from Raquel Nathan from Stellenbosch University. Oh, sorry, and I just also want to mention to the people following us on YouTube that I've got the chat open, so if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to do so. So the question from Raquel is, in the fight against corruption, how can South Africa strike a balance between punitive measures and proactive measures that focus on prevention, such as promoting ethical behavior, fostering a culture of transparency, and incentivizing integrity within public institutions? And Prof. Williams, I think I'd like to ask you to address that question, because we talked about the recruitment needs and kind of that organizational culture shift that needs to happen within state sector institutions. But I don't want to limit it only to the state, because we need to be clear on this fact that corruption is not only a public sector problem.
Go ahead, Prof.
Okay, so you're right that it's not just a public sector problem, but I think its effects are more damaging in the public sector, because when private sector companies have ethical failings, and they do, we know what happens. They lose market share, they go bankrupt, and someone else takes their place. But no one can take the place of the public sector. So that's why I think the focus is on the public sector. And as I've said, I think to Raquel, who's from Stellenbosch, I would ask that people like you decide to go into public service. We don't really have the right people. Rajen has mentioned that. And it's a problem. The public sector has become this place that attracts people who don't have the right intentions, and that hurts all of us. It hurts us whether you're rich, it hurts you whether you're poor. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is people. I mean, when I lived in England, I taught in England for 12 years. When I lived in England, there was a point in time where they found that they had a problem with having the right teachers in public schools. So they set up this whole system where students from the best universities were encouraged to go into teaching. So you find that your teacher went to Oxford, your teacher went to Cambridge, your teacher went to the LSE, right? Because they incentivized them, and it made a massive difference. So those teachers, the brightest and the best, will go into inner city schools, what we would call deprived schools in South Africa, and it changed the game in terms of the outcomes of those schools and students who would otherwise have had poor outcomes. So I think that that's something that we can do. We can make the public sector attractive, and organizations like CAS, like ActionSA can get behind that. Like, if we want the public sector that will deliver the goods, what kind of people do we need in that public sector, and what do we do to get there? And we have, I mean, if I give an example from China, and I speak of this because I used to work with people from there. So in China, the public sector is highly competitive to get in. You basically take an exam over 3 days. Many people faint in that exam because it's rigorous. So only the best and the brightest are, and this is China that I say has serious problems with corruption, but they recognize that there's some things that are non-negotiable. The people in our public sector is non-negotiable, the kind of people we want. So in terms of competence, of capability, of cultural fit, they do everything they can to get those people. And I think who was talking about professionalism earlier, right? So here we have so many square pegs in round holes in the public sector. And this is not to bash public sector, because there's some amazing people, but there's some people you interact with and you think, how did you get here? It's impossible for you to be in this role, but they're there. So we have to think about how do we change that? And it's not a quick fix, but if we can fix that, it will change. I find that a lot of South African, I don't know if it's because we've talked about political well, politicians have a very short-term view of everything. It's the 5-year cycle, it's a 5-year cycle. But I find that a lot of the time we are not willing to do the deep work that needs to change our system. So if we look at education, rather than change approaches in the schools that are failing, we lower the pass mark. And you think, what the absolute fuck is that? I apologize. Sorry, I'm not like, okay. China's ex-justice minister sentenced to death over 60 million corruption. Amen to that. So we think, you think, do the work, fix the schools. It's a long term, it is expensive, but it's a permanent fix rather than, so then you now have kids that come to university, they can't read for meaning. They read at a grade 7 level, but they're post-matric. And you think, why did anybody do this? Like you're failing those kids when you lower the pass rate. And I'm sorry to get onto this, but it's just to illustrate that point of doing the deep work, doing and demanding that of leaders. And I hope that ActionSA is doing everything it can to get into the positions that it needs to be if you are really who you say you are. And I hope you are. Otherwise, don't invite me back. Please just don't. So it's that we have to think about real fixes, not quick fixes, not plasters, low-hanging fruits, yes, but to actually take the roots out if they're bad and replant, and not just stick plasters onto this problem and that problem because we have a short-term view and resources are limited and all that, because those problems are always there. But it's that will to actually how can I radically change this in a way that 20 years later, 30 years later, I'm still reaping the fruits of the work that has been done.
Thank you very much. Let me just read it in case it flew by. And this is, I think, Singapore did this with immediate effect in terms of changing the culture of that society. It says, this report says it's Beijing. A former deputy police minister who was accused of leading a crime gang of government officials was given a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve Friday on charges of manipulating the stock market, taking bribes and other offenses in a case that involved at least 2 former cabinet officials, Chinese state TV reported. So we have big examples to follow. I'm coming to being punitive versus punishment versus, there was a question around balancing out punitive measures. Okay, I think that was coming to you. Was it not? Can you ask the question again? Yeah, the question is
Punitive measures and proactive was the focus of prevention. So how can South Africa strike a balance between punitive measures and proactive measures that focus on prevention?
And I think, who said the horse has already bolted by the time? Was it yourself? Let me give it back to you. Let me give it back to you. I was about to come to you, Dr. Groenewald. Okay, let me give it back to you, Professor Sope. The question around, you said, by the time we're dealing with anti-corruption measures, the horse is already bolted, we should do it before. And so the question is around, how do you balance out, prevention and punitive measures?
Okay, so punitive measures are necessary because no matter how much prevention you have, because we're human beings and everything, there will still be, people that fall through the cracks. But in South Africa, we're not doing either. We're not doing prevention. We're not doing punitive. We're not, So I think one of the things that Zuma successfully did was, or state capture, whatever, was to gut out all our prosecution and investigative capabilities. Before that, we were, among the best in terms of the work that was being done in terms of investigations and prosecutions and, and all that. So we're not doing either. So prosecution is important. That stage is anti-corruption. The fight, if you like, is very, very important. And we need to build capability in that. We need to, and I think there's starting to be a little bit more investment in the MPA. And of course, the SIU, I think, is a lot more successful. So we're doing that a little bit and we're trying to rebuild that. But in terms of prevention, I honestly don't see us do any of that at all. Because we're just talking about, we have this revolving door of corrupt public officials that you lose or you resign from this post because of a scandal, and within months you've popped up in a better in a better place, right, in a more lucrative post, if you like. So that's a thing, and I think that's I'm not, I'm a foreigner, so I don't have any share in any political party, but I think that's really something the ANC has specialized in, is in rewarding unethical conduct. It's like, if you had this big scandal, fear not, you'll be back. It's not the end for you. So I think in terms of that, we need to demand more of them. And I think the media in South Africa is very interesting, because you get the media that are like a dog with a bone. They will hold on to a story until something something happens publicly. And then you have those that, have an agenda that will only highlight certain stories and not others. But I think that issue of having people who have a proven track record of corruption being constantly hired, being constantly moved from one department to another. Like if you look at some of the stories around SARS and Transnet and Prasa and Eskom, there's some names, the same people keep popping up in those state-owned. They've done damage here, and then you send them to destroy the next place. And it's like, sometimes you think this must be intentional because this is crazy, right? So I think in terms of, it is. So you have to think about what are we, so that kind of thing should be a story that we don't let go. Like, no, this guy was in ESCOM, he has a pending court case. Okay, maybe the court case is not going anywhere. But so all of a sudden, he's now in Transnet. How is it possible that he was hired? Because even the public sector recruitment rules don't allow for that. So it shows that someone is, do you understand? Yeah, of course, it's political and all that, but we need to focus on those stories. And the media is a big part of that prevention because they bring things, you know, to light. And if they're doing their job, they shouldn't let go of those stories, even though there are many stories, right? So that's a big part. I won't talk about the recruitment and all that and that culture. And that's the second part. And then I think the third part is the education. So the education, in our schools, we have this course in primary schools and high schools, life skills, where they dump everything in, but they don't dump enough of the right context. So I have kids in grade school and middle school, and it's like, okay, they're learning about the herdsman and the kraal. I like, it's very informative, but how is that going to help? Do you understand? So some of that content is useless. And there are things that kids can learn that can form a part of their character at that age of 0 to 13, where is the most important. So some of the stuff that we teach or that is taught is not useful, and there's space for real life, applicable, useful content that can build a nation. And if you look at countries like Singapore and other countries that have, you would find that in their curriculums, they indoctrinate the kids the way they want them to go. Do you understand? So in China, they have one vision because the kids are indoctrinated. Whether you think that's morally right or wrong is a different argument. But we are not indoctrinating our kids in any direction. It's whatever you say. Do you understand? So we're not focused. We don't give attention to the things that we can actually have control over. And prevention is a big part. So I think there's so much scope to do so much more. And I think, conversations like this are important because we can then say, okay, with our partners, where do we want to move the needle? What do we have influence over? What do we have power over? What can we touch?
Was the Stage Capture Commission a complete waste of time?
I will choose not to comment.
I'll say short answer is no. It was expensive for what it was. However, it wasn't a waste of time because I think it really, really shone a spotlight on how bad things, even people like me who we do that research for a living, are like, oh my word. So and I think it galvanized us South Africans, even ordinary South Africans, because state capture is now in our vocabulary, right? And just let people know that, look, something is happening, and if you don't do anything, it's not going to get better.
Sure. I'm just mindful of time. I know there's still a lot of things that we want to discuss. I think one thing that I just want to bring up that I think if I had to criticize our conversation today from lacking something, it is the role of the media. And I think we've got so much to owe to the media for exposing corruption and holding accountability. I think if it weren't for investigative journalists at places like Amabungane and Ground Up, we would have been in a worse situation that we are in. There is a worrying trend that our media freedom of the press score is declining. So it's something that we need to keep tabs on. And then the other point I wanted to make is, I just want to quickly go to YouTube because I did say that we'll take some questions there. And true to their name, Insidious Anti-Mason asks, what influence would private global organizations like the World Economic Forum have on your policies? And that's for ActionSA. And I'm not going to go into it too much because it's not that relevant to our conversation today. But ActionSA sees South Africa as a global citizen and a player, and we are part of many different organizations, and we will consider everyone's views, but we won't be dictated to. So that's a short answer to that. And then Stembiso Skosana asks, in what way does corruption in South Africa intersect with organized crime, and how can law enforcement agencies and judicial systems address these complex networks effectively? And we've touched on that, and it is about cooperation and capacity building. I think the one question that I also would like to ask, and Klaus, I think I'm going to direct this to you, is we have an election coming up. Corruption doesn't stand outside of that in terms of how it influenced the corruption that's happening, but corruption might actively take place in our election process. And that's whether that's in the form of parties not declaring their funding, parties getting corruption or election funding from illegitimate sources. And there might just be active corruption taking place that impedes the free and fair status of our elections, and that speaks to breaking down our democratic processes. So Klaus, if you can speak to active citizenry in terms of both elections, and then just how can we as citizens, not necessarily people that are actively part in the political process, but corporations, civil society, how can we all work together to protect our democracy against the adverse impact of corruption? Big question.
Thank you. So many things I want to say. If I get to everything, if I make sense, I'll do my best. Election coming up, and the element of corruption. I think it's important to remember that elections are manifest signs and expressions of legitimacy. There will always be some elements that would say that, I mean, we see this around the world. An election takes place, and the one side that loses will come out and say that the election wasn't fair, etc. But I think it's this perception that holds sway. And in South Africa, we have had so far this perception that our elections have been fair. But at the same time, we don't know what we're going to get next year. We're kind of approaching a very difficult space, and even if we look at the Electoral Act and the changes that were brought about, those really speak to legitimacy again in the short term and the long term. What can we do? I think first of all, to go out and vote, to register and vote. I think I wrote a piece recently to express the concern that if we recognize 1994 as our breakthrough, as our moment of democratization, as legitimizing a democratic state through the vote of the people, then we can say that the previous election was really a delegitimization because more people didn't vote than could, and I think that is really worrying. I mean, it speaks to a loss of faith. It speaks to a lot of things. And I think that parties play obviously a huge role in mobilizing their voters and their supporters, but so does civil society in raising it to people that they really have that responsibility and that mandate. That it's often said, if you don't go vote, or at least if you don't spoil your vote, you shouldn't really be saying anything. But I think that I don't want to say education, because voter education kind of implies something specific, but more that it's amongst the population that we believe that our vote will make a difference and does make a difference. And so I see there's different organizations that are doing this, but it's more than just civil society. It's really it's in the home. And it's in the school, and it's in the workspace, and then to segue perfectly to media. Of course, the media we have the role of the media to kind of carry this message of voting and voting representation and opportunity and so forth. But and on the same note, it's very important to give credence to, or at least to respect the massive role that the media has played in the last, I don't know, however many years in South Africa. But I am one to caution very strong against the role of the media as becoming a player in the political game, and that's very, very clear in South Africa. Even though we have a somewhat more free, or how do you say, independent media, there's certain channels that have become so hyper politicized. I mean, if you look at I won't name too many examples, but it's worrying, and it means that we start depending on a unrepresented, or at least a group that let me rather just say the media should not be playing a political partisan role, and it's very possible in the next election that it's going to become that, because we're still very much open. If I may just say one last thing, to go back to the previous question, and that speaks to the national vision and the role of, again, this is really the substance of civil society. We can almost declare as 94 and 89 were seminal moments in 89 in the global sense. You know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is kind of a watershed moment in the world, and it's splitting the world, if it hasn't already, into different poles. And we must be very, very wary of being pulled in one or the other direction. I think that this is an opportunity for us. It's a so-called a critical junction for us to really reactivate what it means for us to be South African. And I'm not saying this to be anti this or pro that, because I think that, again, the media is playing a very poor job in that. But for us to mobilize what we have and who we are, and that's our constitution, that's our constitutional values and national interests. So, a long story, but I'm going to say this one last thing. We must galvanize around these slogans, such as the South African dream. They're not empty. That's the vocabulary that we embody to steer us forward, and we must package it in a productive and a proactive way. And somehow we forgot about the NDP. The NDP said a lot of specifics, and therefore we threw it out. But the NDP really is a vision. And we must go back and galvanize around these visions that can take us forward into doing what I think a few of us have said, is to be more long-term. Thank you. Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you. Athol, I'm going to let you, and then I'm going to giving it to Rajen.
Okay, I've got 4 quick points. I'll be as quick as possible. First of all, we've got to be very wary of creeping authoritarianism in South Africa, especially in our parliamentary system, where it's very parochial. You vote along party lines, and that's the end of the story. Your conscience and your values and ethics are neither here nor there. That's a big issue in South Africa. We see legislation like indigenization and patriotic legislation that's being enacted in Zimbabwe. We're following the same route here in South Africa with much similar initiatives. Secondly, I think our media is fairly good, but our public broadcasting media is really parochial. And many people in this country don't have access to independent media, not the independent group, because they're not independent, but people don't have access to independent media. So they get fed a daily fare of very parochial kind of media that's government aligned, which is a huge concern. And then, somebody used the example about declaration about party political funding. We passed this legislation. We told the ANC that it was bad legislation. Now they hate it. They want to fix it. But nobody declares and nothing happens. There are only 3 political parties that declare. The others make no declaration. The EFF have not made one declaration. So we know they don't run their operation on fresh air. So why is the media not doing anything about that? And then to go to the question about faith-based organizations. Look, faith-based organizations, there's always a lag until they discover their voice. I mean, even the anti-apartheid movements were so frustrated with faith-based organizations, they only came on board right at the end. And now, even in the last 30 years, they've been nowhere. There's sort of a political correctness. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to divide congregations and that kind of thing. But I see that they are starting to speak up a bit, and we need to encourage that more and more. But there is always a lag, unfortunately. From one dispensation to the next, there's a lag, and faith-based organizations, for some indescribable reason, always lag behind. Instead of just following the good book and the word of the good book and do the right thing, there's a lag.
When the hero has kind of, fixed everything. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to round up very quickly, especially on the issue of leadership that I presented on. And I want to do that by commenting on the Zondo Commission. The Zondo Commission, in my opinion, did an excellent job of exposing the happenings and the operations of state capture. And I think it was very informative and enlightening for the people of South Africa to know exactly how that happened, especially for the electorate, to know exactly how that happened and who was responsible. I saw a, sorry, no, I'm coming to that. So I saw an interview with Judge Zondo, and he commented from his side that he had done whatever he could in terms of exposing it. I think the problem arises with the implementation of the recommendations, and also the disappointment that comes with some of that in terms of, and an example is the appointment of David Mashlobo, who has huge question marks over his head for his role in the State Security Agency, being appointed back into cabinet as a deputy minister, national minister. that doesn't augur well, not only for the president, but for the commission itself. But you can't blame Judge Zondo for that, you know. And I come back to the issue of leadership. Our president needs to show the country that he's serious about leading us in a perfect way. Recently, there was a Lady R issue, and the presidency announced that there's going to be a commission of inquiry. Recently, we heard it's actually not a commission of inquiry, it's something else, some inquiry, but it's not a commission of inquiry. So this somersaulting and backflipping needs to stop. We need to be serious about how we want to move forward, and government needs to show us that. And I think we've done an excellent job of thrashing out these issues here today. ActionSA have done well, and I'd like to thank you for inviting Stellenbosch University through. And I hope that all the positive factors that have come through, and so many of them, are going to be actioned by you, because emphasis on your name of your party, ActionSA. So we wish you well with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just want to ensure you that we have no intention of following the independent media route and becoming a party of inaction. I think your point about the Zondo Commission and then the actual implementation thereof, I think it's very telling of our government's priorities that our VIP protection budget is larger than our prosecution budget. So those people that are often the corrupt, the protection we pay, or the amount of money we pay to protect them against the public is quite telling. I think we're going to wrap up now because our time is finished. I'm just going to hand over to Chris for some closing comments from CAS's side, and then Lerato will close off the day for us. And I don't know, unless there's someone that wants to have one last comment, quick one.
We have a colleague who says, "Is it itching?" A colleague of ours, Chief David Dembe, he likes to ask if it's itching.
Thank you, Lerato. We've been talking about public service today, but it takes two to tango. So as a public service official, I cannot necessarily be corrupt without a partner on the outside, so to speak. So we must not forget the private sector. Yeah, the corruptor. I just want to put it there that our focus should not be on the public service only. That's all. Thanks.
Very important point. It actually has been raised before. Go ahead, Chris.
Good. Thank you very much. I presume there will be closing words from Johann. But from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I just want to applaud you for an excellent event. I hope that it is the beginning of a new political culture in South Africa, which refers to evidence, refers to experts in order to develop policy for policy-based politics rather than personality-based politics. And I'd also like to remind everyone in the room with the excellent contributions that it really is a small number of committed people who can make a massive difference. So we shouldn't underestimate the ability of the few to change the lives of the many. And we still have many, many strengths in this country that we shouldn't discount. And I was particularly pleased to see the comics of Zapiro. We often have visitors coming to South Africa and they say, if anybody can still publish things like that, your country is not too bad a place. And I really do think that we can speak very freely and we're making use of it. And the direction of travel to me is clear, which is people are fed up and there is a change coming. And it's not going to be a change just in government, but it will also be a change in the ANC, because there's nothing like losing absolute power to make you change your game. So thank you very much again to ActionSA. Thank you to the experts that were willing to come here. I hope that you will make yourself available to other parties as well. It's no longer a case of the parties being out there. We are the parties as citizens, and we have to inform the parties and be a part of their thinking process. So thank you very much. Johann.
So yes, just to further on, because I just want to express our immense gratitude for volunteering your time today. Just so you are aware, you are volunteering your time. You can't send us an invoice afterwards. So thank you so much. And I want to express the fact that this is not the end of the discussion. Today, this is the end of today, but it's not the end of the discussion. And we would like to keep you involved with us, with the political process in general, to make sure that all of us work together to really bringing this country back to or unlocking the potential that we know this country has, and making this place that we love a place that everybody can love and is a place worthy of our love. With that, I'll hand over to Lerato to.
I'm not sure why, because the thinking has been achieved.
Yeah, I think last one is just to say thank you for everyone online for viewing, following the proceedings today, and we appreciate it. And there will be more of these sessions happening in the future. Next week, on the 14th, we are having our session on economic prosperity. On the 20th, we will have a morning session on climate change and the environment. And in the afternoon, we will be talking about foreign policy, again, with some experts that know way more than we do. So please keep on following that. And yeah.
Well,
thank you so much.
my closing remarks will be this. This is not foreign to ActionSA. We said it at the beginning of the session. I want to reiterate it to say that we were formed outside or following a process called the People's Dialogue. And our sense is that we no longer need political parties or politicians dictating how we must be. It is society who must give politicians their job descriptions. And that's what we're trying to get to as an organization, so that we build a more sustainable political system than the one that we are currently experiencing. So that is the sole purpose of this process, leading up to our policy conference that is coming up in September. So everything that has been mentioned here is both recorded and jotted down, so it will inform how we frame the discussions at the policy conference. So I hope that some of you I will see in September to help us do just that. Thank you so much to each and every one of you. Lunch is now served. Meeting adjourned.